I remember the first time I pulled up to that old cabin. It was late in the afternoon, the kind of time of day when the sun hangs low and the air cools down fast. The gravel road was rough, full of ruts, and my truck bounced around as I drove deeper into the trees. It had taken almost 4 hours to get there, most of that on narrow back roads that seemed to get smaller and more isolated the further I went. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to a guy I knew through work who told me I could use it for a weekend if I wanted some time away. He said it was quiet, no one ever around, the kind of place where you could clear your head. At the time, that sounded perfect. The cabin stood alone in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and thick undergrowth. It was old but sturdy, built out of dark logs that had turned nearly black with age. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the windows were small and square with shutters that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. There was no sign of other people anywhere. No nearby houses, no power lines, no sound of traffic. Just the wind moving through the trees and the faint sound of water somewhere close by. When I stepped out of the truck, the air smelled sharp and earthy, full of pine and damp soil. It was quiet in a way that felt heavy, like the woods were pressing in on all sides. I hauled my bags out of the truck, locked it, and walked up the few wooden steps onto the porch. The boards creaked under my boots. The key my friend gave me worked fine, and the door opened with a stiff groan. Inside, the air was stale, a mix of old wood and dust. The cabin had one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen off to the side, and a short hallway that led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The furniture was simple: wooden chairs, a small table, a couch with faded cushions. It looked like no one had stayed there in a long time, but everything was in decent shape. I set my bags down and opened a few windows to let in fresh air. That first evening was quiet. I unpacked a little, started a small fire in the fireplace, and cooked some canned soup I had brought along. I didn't have cell service, but I expected that. My friend had told me there wasn't any coverage out there. It didn't bother me at first. The point of the trip was to be disconnected. After dinner, I sat outside on the porch for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The sky grew dark fast, and the woods turned into a wall of black around the clearing. When I finally went back inside, I noticed something I hadn't before. One of the chairs at the table was pulled out, angled slightly like someone had been sitting there. I was sure I hadn't touched it. It made me pause. I pushed it back under the table and told myself I was overthinking it. Probably whoever stayed there last left it that way. That night, I didn't sleep well. The cabin creaked and groaned with the wind, and every sound felt amplified in the silence. I kept waking up, listening, waiting. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside on the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate steps. I held my breath and listened hard. But when I finally got up and peeked through the window, there was nothing. Just darkness and the faint outline of trees. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I went for a walk through the woods, following a narrow trail that led downhill toward the sound of water. I found a stream about half a mile from the cabin, moving steady over rocks. I stayed there a while, listening to the rush of water, then walked further down the trail. The deeper I went, the less at ease I felt. The forest was dense, and every direction looked the same. I had the strange sensation of being watched, though I never saw anyone. Eventually, I turned back. When I came up the trail toward the cabin, I froze. The door was open. I knew I had closed it when I left. My first thought was that maybe I hadn't latched it properly, and the wind had blown it open. But when I got closer, I saw the doorknob moving slightly, like it was still settling from being turned. My stomach dropped. Inside, everything looked the same. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken. Still, I checked every room, every closet, even under the beds. No one was there. But one thing caught my eye. The chair at the table, the same one from before, was pulled out again. I pushed it back in and stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself I wasn't imagining things. That night, I decided to stay awake as long as I could. I kept a flashlight by my side and sat in the living room with the fire burning low. Around midnight, I heard it again, the sound of someone walking slowly on the porch. The boards creaked under weight that wasn't mine. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For nearly an hour, I didn't move. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. Finally, the sound drifted off, and I heard nothing but the wind again. I stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to sleep. By the third day, my nerves were stretched thin. I thought about leaving, but part of me wanted to prove it was nothing. Just my imagination playing tricks. Still, I started noticing smaller details I couldn't explain. My bag had been moved from one side of the bedroom to the other. A jar in the kitchen was left open when I knew I had closed it. The chair was always pulled out no matter how many times I pushed it back in. That afternoon, I stepped outside to chop some wood. The air was cold, the sky overcast. As I swung the axe, I caught sight of something in the tree line. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then I realized it was a person, someone standing among the trees watching me. I froze, the axe heavy in my hands. The figure didn't move. I couldn't see details, just a shape, tall, still, blending with the trees. After what felt like forever, I looked away to blink, and when I looked back, they were gone. I dropped the axe and went back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I pulled the curtains shut. That night, I built up the fire high and sat with my back to the wall. I could hear movement outside again, circling the cabin this time. Footsteps crunching in the dirt, pausing, then moving again. At one point, I heard the faint sound of the doorknob rattling. Whoever it was, they were trying to get in. I didn't sleep. By morning, the noises had stopped, but the ground outside told me I wasn't imagining things. Clear footprints circled the cabin, fresh in the dirt, leading in and out of the woods. I knew then I couldn't stay. I packed my things in a rush, shoving everything into my bag without care. When I stepped outside, the forest was dead silent, too quiet. I carried my bag to the truck, my eyes darting to the trees the whole time. The cab of the truck felt like the only safe place left. The engine started on the first try, and I pulled out fast, gravel spraying behind me. As I drove down the narrow road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out into the clearing behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main highway with other cars around me. Only then did the weight of it hit me. Someone had been out there. Not a ghost, not my imagination, someone real. Someone who wanted me to know I wasn't alone. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't tell my friend the full story either. I just said it wasn't for me. But the memory has never left me. The sound of those footsteps, the sight of that figure in the trees, the chair always pulled out like an invitation I didn't understand. I think about it sometimes late at night, wondering how long they had been watching me before I noticed, wondering what would have happened if I had stayed just one more night. I drove deeper into the woods than I should have, the narrow road twisting and breaking apart the further I went. I had rented a small cabin for a week, a quiet getaway far away from the noise of town and the mess of my daily life. The listing online had promised peace, tall trees all around, a stream nearby, and no neighbors within miles. That part had been what pulled me in. I wanted nothing but the sound of wind in the trees, the crackle of a fire, and maybe a long hike every day to keep my head clear. It seemed harmless enough when I booked it, but by the time I reached the last mile of dirt road, with my car bouncing and scraping rocks, I started to feel that strange weight in my stomach that comes when you realize you've gone too far into something, and there's no easy way back. The cabin sat in a clearing, older than it had looked in the pictures. The boards were dark with age, the roof patched in a few spots, and the front steps leaned a little as if one strong storm could knock them down. Still, it was standing, and when I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, I could smell the old wood and damp stone of the fireplace. There was one main room with a small kitchen corner, a couch, a table, and a single bedroom to the side. The windows were thin, glass a little wavy from age, and though the place had been swept, it still carried the scent of being shut for too long. I unloaded my bags and set up. The air outside was cooler than I expected for the season, and the trees pressed in so tightly around the clearing that even at noon it felt dim. I kept telling myself that was the charm of it, the isolation, but as I stacked my food in the small fridge and put my sleeping bag on the bed, the silence felt heavier than I thought it would. No distant cars, no planes overhead, just birds somewhere far off and the rustle of branches. That first evening I walked down the narrow path that led away from the cabin. It went through the trees, past a slope where moss grew thick, and I found the stream the listing had mentioned. The water was clear and cold, running over rocks with a soft noise that cut the silence in a way that was almost comforting. I stayed there until it grew darker than I realized, then made my way back with my flashlight on. Inside the cabin, I lit the fire. The wood stacked outside was dry enough, and soon the flames filled the room with heat. I cooked a simple meal, ate by the fire, and told myself the unease I felt would go away after a good night's sleep. But lying in bed later, the creaks of the old cabin were louder than I thought they'd be. Boards shifted, the roof gave a soft pop as it cooled, and the trees outside groaned as the wind moved through them. At first I thought that was all I heard, until there was something else, something faint like the crunch of leaves underfoot. I held my breath and listened, staring at the thin curtains by the window. The sound faded. I told myself it was just the woods settling, maybe a deer moving nearby, and forced my eyes shut. The next day I hiked deeper into the forest. The trails weren't marked, but I had my GPS and a map, and I figured I could handle myself. I climbed ridges, walked along thick brush, and found another part of the stream where it widened into a pool. The sun hit the water just right, and for a moment I felt the kind of peace I had come out here to find. But on the way back I noticed something that stuck with me. On the ground, not far from the cabin, there were tracks in the dirt, not mine. Heavy boots. At first I thought maybe they were old, left by whoever managed the place. But they looked fresh. The edges were sharp, not softened by rain or time. I knelt down and pressed my fingers into one, comparing it to my own boot print. Bigger, deeper, pointing toward the cabin. That night I couldn't relax. Every sound outside seemed sharper, and I kept glancing at the windows. When I finally drifted off, I woke up again a few hours later to a faint noise. Not the wind, not the crack of wood. It was a scrape, light but deliberate, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I lay still, heart pounding, ears straining. Then came a soft thump near the back wall. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound faded again after a few seconds, but I stayed awake until the sky outside turned gray. By morning, I tried to reason it out. Maybe an animal had brushed against the wall. A bear, a raccoon, something like that. I walked around the cabin, checking the ground. I found more prints. Not animal, boots. They circled the cabin in uneven lines, some close to the windows, some near the door. My stomach twisted when I realized some of them overlapped my own tracks from the day before. Whoever it was had been walking close, checking things while I was inside sleeping. I thought about leaving then. Packing up, driving back down the rough road, calling it a failed trip. But the stubborn part of me said maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe it was a hunter passing through. Maybe it was nothing. I tried to hold on to that thought, but as the day passed, I kept checking the tree line. Every shift of branches made me snap my head up. Every shadow looked like it held someone standing just far enough back to be unseen. That night, I decided to stay awake for a while. I killed the lights, let the fire die down, and sat on the couch in the dark. I kept my flashlight in my lap, waiting. Hours dragged by. My eyes ached from staring out the window, and just when I thought I'd give up, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not heavy, but slow. Careful, crunching leaves. The sound circled the cabin, then stopped. I held my breath. My chest ached from how hard my heart pounded. The sound started again, closer this time, until I could swear it was just outside the wall by the window. I gripped the flashlight so tight my fingers hurt. Then came the faintest tap against the glass. I froze. The window didn't break, nothing pushed harder, just a single tap. My skin crawled all over. I wanted to leap up, to yell, to chase whoever it was away, but I stayed there rigid. After a few minutes, the sound faded again. The footsteps moved off into the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the next morning, I had made up my mind. I packed most of my things into the car, but when I turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. It clicked once, then went dead. My hands shook as I tried again and again, but nothing. I popped the hood, though I barely knew what I was looking at. I saw it right away. Wires had been cut clean through. Someone had been under the hood while I slept. I stood there, cold creeping through me even though the sun was out. The nearest town was miles away, and the dirt road barely saw any traffic. My phone had no service, not even a flicker of a signal. I was trapped. The rest of the day I stayed inside the cabin. I kept the door locked, curtains drawn. Every so often I thought I heard movement in the woods, but I told myself it was just my nerves. When night came, I put a chair under the doorknob and sat with the fireplace poker in my hands. The silence was unbearable, every second dragging, my body tense and waiting. Hours passed before the sound returned. Slow steps again, circling, closer. I heard the porch creak, a board bending under weight. Then the knob rattled, gentle but steady, testing it. The chair shifted slightly but held. My mouth went dry as I gripped the poker tighter. The rattling stopped. For a long time, nothing. Then the sound of someone walking away. I didn't move until the first light of morning crept through the curtains. When I finally stepped outside, I saw more boot prints on the porch, pressed deep as if whoever it was had stood there for a long time. I checked the windows, and on one of them, the dirt of a fingertip streaked down the glass where someone had dragged it slowly. I knew I couldn't last much longer like this. I gathered what food I could carry, stuffed water bottles into my backpack, and decided to hike out. The road was long, but if I followed it, I'd reach town eventually. I locked the cabin out of habit, though I knew it didn't matter. Then I started walking. The trees closed in around me quick. The road stretched rough and endless, my pack heavy, my eyes flicking to every rustle. More than once, I thought I heard steps behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing but empty trees. Still, I walked faster. After hours, my legs shook from exhaustion. I hadn't seen a car, hadn't seen a sign of anyone. The road twisted through hills and forest, and the silence pressed down thicker than ever. By the time the sun began to drop, my chest was tight with panic. I hadn't thought it through. Night would fall again, and I'd be caught out here in the open. That was when I saw it. A figure standing far down the road. Still waiting. My stomach turned to ice. I couldn't make out details at that distance, but I saw the shape of broad shoulders, the outline of boots. I froze, heart hammering, then turned off into the trees. Branches scraped my arms as I forced my way through, trying to circle wide, moving as fast as I could without running. For what felt like hours, I pushed through the forest, stumbling, my breath harsh in my throat. I didn't see the figure again, but I never stopped feeling watched. By the time I stumbled onto another dirt road, the sun had nearly vanished. My body screamed for rest, but I pushed on, praying for a sign of life. Finally, in the dark, I saw headlights in the distance, a truck rattling down the road. I staggered out, waving my arms, my throat raw from shouting. The truck slowed, stopped, and for the first time in days, I felt the crushing weight lift just enough to breathe. I never went back for my car. I had been looking forward to a few quiet days away from the noise of the city. I had found the cabin online, a small old place tucked deep in the woods far from the nearest town. It looked like exactly what I needed. Just a single-room wooden cabin with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and an outhouse a short walk behind it. There was no electricity, no running water, and no cell service. The photos showed a lake not far from the cabin, with tall pines and thick undergrowth surrounding it. It was advertised as private, remote, and peaceful. That was exactly what I was after. I drove out early in the morning, my car loaded with food, water jugs, a sleeping bag, some books, and basic camping gear. The drive took almost 5 hours, most of it along winding back roads that got narrower and bumpier the farther I went. By the last stretch, the road had turned to dirt with potholes big enough to jolt the car. The trees grew thicker, hanging over the road, blotting out much of the sky. When I finally saw the clearing with the cabin sitting in it, I felt a wave of relief. It was smaller than I had pictured. The wood was dark and weathered, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. A stack of cut firewood leaned against one wall, half rotting, half fresh. The lake was visible through the trees, still and gray, reflecting the sky. The place looked lonely, but also quiet in the way I had wanted. I carried my things inside. The cabin smelled of damp wood and dust with a faint sour odor, maybe from rodents. There was one main room with a wood stove, a narrow bed frame with a thin mattress, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. A few shelves on the wall held mismatched plates, an old lantern, and some cans of food that looked far past their expiration date. There were nails hammered into the beams where people had hung coats or tools long ago. The floor creaked under my boots and I noticed mouse droppings in the corners. I spent the first hour sweeping, wiping down the table and setting up my gear. I unpacked water jugs, canned food, a camp stove, and my sleeping bag. I tested the wood stove with some kindling and found it drew smoke properly up the chimney. By the time I had everything in order, the sun was already dipping lower, throwing long shadows across the clearing. The quietness was heavier than I expected. No cars, no voices, no distant hum of anything man-made. Just the faint rustle of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch, and the lapping of the lake against the shore. It should have felt peaceful, but instead it felt like being shut inside a soundproof box, where every small noise carried too much weight. That first night, I cooked a small meal on the camp stove and sat at the table while the light faded outside. The woods grew darker until the cabin's single window was just a black square. I lit a lantern and set it on the table, its yellow light casting shadows across the rough walls. The silence pressed in harder. When I finally lay down on the mattress in my sleeping bag, I couldn't relax. Every creak of the cabin sounded louder. I heard scurrying in the walls, probably mice. Then a knock-like sound from the roof, like something dropping onto it or stepping across it. It could have been a pine cone or an animal, but my chest tightened every time it came. The night dragged on, with me drifting in and out of shallow sleep, waking up at the smallest sound. In the morning, sunlight poured through the window, and I felt a bit foolish. Everything seemed less threatening in the daylight. I walked down to the lake, which looked clearer and calmer than before. The air was crisp and I could see small fish darting near the surface. I sat for a while, soaking in the view, until I noticed footprints in the mud near the water's edge. They weren't mine. I had only been down to the water once, briefly, and I had stayed on the rocks. These prints were different, barefoot, long and narrow. The toes were deep in the mud as if whoever it was had pressed down hard. There were several of them, leading out of the trees and stopping right near the shore. Then they turned back into the woods. I crouched down, staring at them. They looked fresh. The edges hadn't been softened by rain or wind. Someone had been there recently, maybe last night or early this morning. My skin prickled. I stood up and scanned the tree line, but everything was still. Just tall pines and dense undergrowth. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hiker passing through. Maybe some local who knew about the lake, but I had rented the place for its privacy. There weren't supposed to be other people around. I tried to push the thought away as I went back to the cabin, but the silence of the woods felt different now, heavier, as if it was holding something in. That night, I made sure to bar the cabin door with a piece of wood I found outside. I sat by the lantern reading, but every time the wind shifted or a branch creaked, my eyes jumped to the window. I didn't sleep much again. At some point deep into the night, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. Not animals, too steady, too deliberate. They moved slowly around the cabin. I held my breath, lying still in the bed, my heart hammering. The steps circled once, then faded. I waited, straining to hear, but there was nothing after that. I didn't move until dawn light started to creep into the window. When I went outside, I saw them. More footprints. This time in the dirt around the cabin. Barefoot again, they went right up to the door, then around to the window, then back into the woods. The rest of the day I couldn't settle. I kept pacing the clearing, scanning the trees, trying to catch any sign of someone watching. But the forest gave nothing back. Just stillness, just silence. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back to town. But the road was long and rough, and something in me wanted to believe I was overreacting. That evening, I forced myself to act normal. I cooked, I read, I wrote a little in my notebook. But as the darkness closed in, the tension wound tight in my stomach. I kept the lantern low and lay in bed with my ears straining. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. The steps. Slow, careful, moving across the clearing. My throat went dry. Then the sound of fingernails or fingertips brushing against the wall. A slow dragging sound right outside. I stayed frozen. My mind was racing with what I should do. Shout, grab the hatchet I had, or just stay quiet. I chose quiet. The dragging went past the window, then stopped. I lay there in the dark, gripping the handle of the hatchet so hard my hand cramped. After what felt like hours, I heard the steps retreat. They faded into the trees, but I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I checked the clearing. There were marks on the wall near the window, faint smears where something, maybe a hand, had touched the wood. The footprints were there again, circling the cabin. That was when I decided I had to leave. I gathered my things quickly, stuffing them back into the car. My hands shook as I worked, every sound making me glance over my shoulder. I kept expecting to see someone standing in the trees. I started the car and drove fast down the dirt road. The branches scraped the sides, the potholes jolted the tires, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. When I reached the main road, I finally let out a breath I felt I had been holding for 2 days. I drove all the way back to town without stopping. When I returned the keys at the small office that managed the cabin rentals, I didn't say anything about what had happened. I just handed them over and left. For days afterward, I kept thinking about those footprints, about the sound of someone moving slowly around the cabin while I lay inside, pretending to sleep. Whoever it was hadn't tried to break in. They hadn't spoken. They had just circled and watched. That was worse somehow, not knowing who it was or what they wanted, just knowing they had been there. Even now, when I think about the cabin, what sticks with me most isn't the silence of the woods or the loneliness of being out there. It's the feeling that the whole time I was there, I wasn't alone. Someone else had chosen to be out there too, watching me through the cracks of the trees, leaving their prints in the dirt, reminding me that the woods don't always belong to the person who thinks they've rented them. That was the last time I ever went looking for a cabin in the woods. I had been planning to take a break away from everything for weeks. Life had started to feel like a loop of noise, screens, and routines, and I wanted something quiet. Something far from the constant vibration of my phone or the endless rumble of traffic outside my apartment. When a friend mentioned a small cabin he knew about, tucked into a stretch of woods 3 hours away, I thought it sounded perfect. It wasn't a vacation spot or a rental you could find online. The cabin belonged to a distant relative of his who barely ever used it, and he said it was just sitting there gathering dust. It had no internet, no TV, no one around for miles. That description stuck with me. It sounded lonely, but it also sounded like exactly what I was craving. I packed light. A duffel with clothes, a sleeping bag, a lantern, matches, a small camping stove, canned food, some jerky, a book, a hunting knife, and a flashlight. I made sure I had a small first aid kit and a few bottles of water, though the cabin supposedly had a hand pump outside. Before I left, I checked the weather. Clear skies, cold nights, nothing unusual. The drive itself was easy enough at first. Open highways, the kind of roads where your mind wanders as trees blur by. The last hour, though, changed everything. The paved road ended and turned into a rough dirt trail that seemed to stretch deeper and deeper into the woods. Tall pines closed in from both sides, and the sun barely reached through. The trail twisted so many times I kept thinking I had gotten lost. But eventually I saw the small clearing open up, and there it was. The cabin. It wasn't much to look at. A single-story wooden structure, weathered and darkened with age. The roof sagged slightly. The steps up to the porch creaked when I tested them, and the windows were clouded with dust. The door was unlocked, just like my friend said it would be. Inside, the air smelled stale, like wood and something faintly metallic. The cabin had only 2 rooms. A small main room with a table, an old iron stove, and a bed frame with a thin mattress, and then a smaller back room that looked more like storage. It felt abandoned but not destroyed. Dust was thick on every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners. A small window above the sink looked out into the trees, and I noticed how close they pressed in, how the branches seemed to crowd the clearing. I lit a lantern, set down my things, and tried to shake the unease. The first night was fine. Quiet, almost too quiet, but I told myself that was the point. I cooked some beans on the stove, ate in silence, and then unrolled my sleeping bag on the mattress. I thought I'd have trouble falling asleep without city noise, but my body gave in quickly. When I woke in the middle of the night, though, I noticed something that unsettled me. The woods were absolutely still. No crickets, no owls, no rustling. Just silence. I convinced myself it was normal. Different parts of the country, different wildlife. I went back to sleep. The next day I explored the area. Behind the cabin, a faint trail cut into the trees. I followed it, thinking it might lead to a stream or just loop around. The air was cool, damp, and heavy with the scent of pine needles. The further I walked, the darker it became. The trees crowded closer, and I kept glancing back to make sure I could still see the way I had come. After about half a mile, the trail ended abruptly at a thicket of brush. Nothing unusual. I turned back, but as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching me. Back at the cabin, I spent most of the afternoon reading and cooking. The stillness nagged at me, but I tried to ignore it. That night, though, the quiet pressed in harder. I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the ceiling when I heard it, the faint crunch of leaves outside. Not constant, not steady, but a single crunch, then nothing. Then another, slower, closer. I held my breath. The cabin walls were thin, and I imagined a deer passing by. I wanted to believe that, but the crunching didn't move on. It stopped just beyond the wall where the window sat. My heart pounded, and I stayed as still as possible, barely even breathing. Minutes passed. Then finally, the sound faded away, deeper into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. The following morning, I checked outside. The ground was littered with old pine needles and patches of dirt. I searched around the window where I'd heard the sounds, but the ground was too messy to show clear prints. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe not. I told myself to relax. I cooked breakfast, pumped water, read a little, and by midday I felt better. But I couldn't shake the memory of those steps. To distract myself, I decided to tidy the cabin. In the back room, stacked against the wall, I found a pile of old tools. Rusted saws, a broken lantern, a box of nails. Beside it was a trunk. Its lid was cracked but not locked, and curiosity got the better of me. I opened it. Inside were clothes. Old flannel shirts, worn pants, boots. All of them looked decades old, stiff with age. Underneath was a rolled-up tarp stained with something dark. I didn't touch it. The air in the small room felt suddenly heavier, like I had opened something that should have stayed closed. I shut the trunk and left it alone. That night the noises came again. This time they weren't just footsteps. I woke to a faint scraping sound against the porch, then a creak. The wood groaned as if weight had pressed onto it. My chest tightened and I gripped the handle of my hunting knife under the sleeping bag. I waited, every muscle tense. The creaking stopped. The silence stretched. Then eventually my exhaustion pulled me back into a restless sleep. By the third day, my nerves were frayed. I debated leaving early, but stubbornness kept me there. I wanted to prove to myself it was nothing, just wildlife, just my mind playing tricks. I forced myself to take another walk, deeper this time. About a mile in, I found something strange. A small clearing, circular, with the ground disturbed. It wasn't natural. The dirt looked as if it had been dug up and pressed back down. No tools lay around, no signs of animals, just disturbed soil in a rough oval shape. The sight unsettled me so badly that I hurried back to the cabin, refusing to look over my shoulder, even though I felt eyes on me the whole way. That night was the worst. I tried barricading the door with the table, even though it seemed pointless. As darkness fell, I sat in the corner with the lantern low and my knife in hand. Hours crawled by, and then I heard it again. The crunch of leaves, slow, deliberate. This time there was no pause. The steps circled the cabin, one side to the other, dragging slightly as if whoever or whatever it was wanted me to hear. I gripped the knife tighter, heart hammering. Then came the scrape of something against the wall. Not claws, not an animal. It sounded like metal dragging across wood. Slowly, carefully, I reached up and blew out the lantern. The cabin plunged into darkness, but I felt safer that way, unseen. I stayed awake all night, listening as the sounds eventually faded. When the first light broke, I pushed the table aside, opened the door, and stepped outside. On the porch, in the dust and dirt, were footprints. Human footprints, bare feet, long and narrow, pressed deep into the wood dust as if someone had stood there for hours. They led to the side of the cabin and then vanished into the woods. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my bag as quickly as I could, not caring about the food I left behind. I bolted for the car, started the engine, and drove down the dirt trail faster than was safe, the trees blurring by on both sides. Only when I hit the paved road did I finally breathe. My hands shook on the wheel, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees watching me go. I never went back. I never asked my friend about that cabin, never told him what I had heard or seen. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I hear it again, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps circling in the dark, waiting just outside thin wooden walls, and I know that whoever was out there had been there long before me and will be there long after. I had always liked being out in quiet places, away from towns, away from noise. That was why I had agreed to use the old cabin that a friend of mine mentioned once. It wasn't really his, but he knew the owner, an older man who didn't use it anymore. The man had said anyone could stay there as long as they didn't leave trash or break anything. I thought it sounded perfect, a good way to spend a long weekend by myself. The drive out was longer than I expected. It was late autumn, the air sharp and cold, the leaves mostly down. The roads got smaller and rougher as I went until it was just dirt and stone, the kind that rattled the car and made me slow down. When I finally parked, I still had to walk about half a mile down a narrow trail with my bag on my back. The trees grew close together there, tall pines mixed with bare maples, the ground covered in dead leaves. The cabin showed itself at the end of the path, a squat shape with a roof darkened by years of weather. It wasn't big, just one main room with a little kitchen area, a table, a bed in the corner, and a wood stove that looked old but solid. There was a shed off to the side, and a rusted metal barrel near it where it looked like people burned trash. A small creek ran behind the place, just far enough away that I could hear it if I stood outside. I set my bag down inside, breathed in that smell of wood and dust that all old cabins seem to have, and felt glad I had come. I unpacked, stacked some firewood near the stove, and checked the windows. They were all simple, no locks, just latches. The door was thick but plain, with a hook inside to keep it shut. The first night was quiet. I sat at the table with a lantern, writing a little and listening to the wind outside. The cabin creaked now and then, the way old wood does when the air cools. I went to bed early, pulling the heavy blanket around me, listening to the stove crackle as I drifted off. The next morning, I went down to the creek to wash my face. The water was icy. I looked at the trees and how still everything was. No cars, no voices, just the faint rush of water and the occasional snap of a branch when a bird moved. I felt like I had stepped out of the world for a while. I walked around the area that day, following game trails, finding where deer had pressed paths through the brush. There were old beer cans in one spot near a log, maybe from hunters years ago. Otherwise, it didn't look like many people came out there. That made me feel safe at first, but that night something changed. I had gone to bed with the fire low, the lantern out, everything still. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. It wasn't a sound that woke me exactly, more the feeling that I wasn't alone. I lay there listening, not moving at first, just holding my breath. The cabin was dark, only a faint line of moonlight coming through the window. Then I heard it. A crunch on the leaves outside, slow and heavy, like someone was walking near the wall. My skin tightened all over. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or even a bear, though the steps sounded measured, not wandering. They stopped, then after a pause there was another, closer, right outside the wall. I stayed still, listening. The steps moved again, not fast, just circling. Whoever or whatever it was, it went all the way around the cabin, the sound of weight shifting on dry leaves. After a while the noise faded and I was left staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, ears straining for anything else. I didn't sleep much after that. When the sun finally came through the window, I got up and went outside. The leaves were disturbed all around, pressed flat in spots like footprints. They were human. I could see the shape of boots. Someone had walked around the cabin in the dark, slow and close. The air felt different after that. I spent the day trying to calm myself. I told myself maybe it was just someone passing through, maybe a hunter curious about the place. But the prints weren't leading away. They circled, then stopped at the door, then moved off into the trees. It hadn't been someone lost or just wandering. They had stood right there outside while I slept inside. That night I built up the fire bigger than before. I locked the hook on the door and sat at the table with the lantern on, pretending to read. Every small sound outside made me look up. A branch broke once in the distance and my whole body tensed. I finally lay down, but sleep came slow and shallow. Sometime in the night, I woke again. This time, I didn't have to wonder if I heard something. The door creaked, just slightly, like weight had touched it. I sat up in bed, not moving further. The hook was set. I knew it was, but the sound of wood shifting under pressure was real. There was silence for a long time after that. No steps, no breathing, nothing. I lay back, not taking my eyes off the door. Eventually, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, light was pushing through the window. When I checked the door in the morning, the wood around the latch was marked. Scraped like someone had pressed hard against it, maybe with a shoulder. It hadn't given, but the marks were new. I didn't like the idea of staying, but leaving meant walking half a mile to the car, then miles more on empty roads. If someone was out there, they could be anywhere along the trail. I thought about packing up that morning, but I didn't. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then go early. That day, I barely left the cabin. I kept looking out the windows, scanning the trees, feeling like I'd see someone standing there watching. Nothing moved but the wind and a few birds. As the sun went down, I made a plan. I put the lantern near the window with my jacket hanging beside it, so from outside it would look like I was sitting at the table. Then I sat in the dark on the bed with the fire low, listening. Hours passed like that. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. My eyes strained in the dark. I kept thinking about the prints, the sound of steps, the scrape at the door. Then I heard it again. Not steps this time, but a faint, careful sound at the window, like a hand brushing the wall. My chest locked up. I stayed still, eyes on the faint outline of the lantern and jacket, pretending to be asleep on the bed. The sound came again, then stopped. Minutes dragged. Then I smelled it, the faint whiff of smoke, sharp and wrong. My stomach dropped. I stood and moved fast to the stove. The fire inside was almost out. The smell wasn't from that. I went to the window. At first I didn't see it. Then I did. Near the shed, the barrel glowed faintly. Smoke drifted up. Whoever was out there had lit something in it. Maybe trying to scare me, maybe worse, I didn't think. I grabbed my bag, shoved what I could inside, and opened the back window. It was small, but I squeezed through, dropping hard on the ground. The air was freezing, but I barely felt it. I crouched, listening, no sound, just the smoke. I went into the trees, moving low, careful away from the glow of the cabin. I didn't take the trail. I went the other way, through brush and fallen branches, keeping the cabin behind me. Every step I expected to hear someone following, but all I heard was my own breath. I walked like that for what felt like hours, until I finally saw the faint shape of the road through the trees. My car was half a mile the other way down the trail, but I wasn't going back for it. I stuck to the trees until I came out onto the dirt road further up, then followed it fast as I could, shivering with every sound behind me. I didn't stop until I saw headlights, a truck coming slow down the road. I waved it down and the driver pulled over, looking at me like I was half crazy standing there in the cold with my bag. I didn't explain much. I just asked for a ride back to town. I never went back for the car myself. Someone else picked it up days later. The cabin still stands out there, but I don't think about it much, except sometimes at night when a floor creaks or the wind scrapes the house. Then I remember the sound of footsteps circling slow, the scrape at the door and the glow of smoke rising behind the glass. And I know I'll never go out there alone again. I had wanted to spend some time away from people, away from noise, away from work and the constant sound of cars outside my apartment window. A few months earlier, I found an old cabin listed for rent online, sitting alone in a wooded valley not far from a lake. The photos showed a small place with one room, a little porch and trees crowding close on every side. It looked quiet, and that was what I wanted. I booked it for a week, thinking I could spend my days reading, hiking, and clearing my head. When I pulled into the long dirt drive and parked in front of it, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it really was. No sound of cars, no voices, just the wind pushing through tall pines. The cabin looked even smaller in person, with weathered boards, a sloping roof, and a door that hung a little crooked on its hinges. It looked like no one had stayed there in years, maybe even decades. I carried my bag inside and found the inside as bare as the photos had shown. A small bed sat against one wall, a table in the center, and a wood stove in the corner. The air smelled of old wood and dust. The window glass was slightly fogged with age, and a few spider webs stretched across the corners of the ceiling. I liked it right away because it felt cut off from everything, exactly what I wanted. That first day I unpacked, chopped some wood stacked beside the porch, and cooked a simple meal on the stove. I walked down a trail that led toward the lake, watched the water shift in the late light, then came back as the woods turned dark. When night fell, I lit a lantern and sat at the table with a book. At some point I noticed the silence again, how total it was. No hum of distant roads, no faint sound of planes, only the occasional creak of the wood in the walls. That night I slept well, though the darkness inside the cabin felt heavier than I expected. There was no glow of city lights outside, only blackness pressing against the glass. When I woke once in the night, I couldn't even see my hand until I lit the lantern. The second day I explored farther. I walked a few miles through the woods carrying a small pack. The trees stood close together, and the trail thinned in places, but I managed to find my way back easily. In the afternoon, clouds built overhead and rain started to fall. I stayed inside the cabin and listened to the drops hitting the roof. I thought again about how much I enjoyed being there. It felt like no one knew where I was. That night I had more trouble sleeping. I kept hearing things outside, snaps of branches, something shifting in the leaves. At first I thought it might be deer moving through the woods, but a few times the sound seemed closer, right near the cabin walls. I told myself it was probably raccoons or other animals looking for food. Still, I lay awake longer than I wanted, staring at the dark ceiling. On the third day I woke with the plan to hike again, but something about the night stayed with me. I felt uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. I spent most of the morning chopping more wood, stacking it neatly by the porch, then went for a shorter walk. Every sound in the woods seemed sharper than before. A branch snapping in the distance made me stop and listen too long. A hollow tree knocking in the wind made me tighten my grip on the hatchet I carried. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something that unsettled me more. Near the steps of the porch, the ground looked disturbed, as if someone had walked there while I was gone. I knelt down and saw faint prints in the dirt. They didn't look like animal tracks. They looked like boots. I stood there a long time, staring at them, trying to convince myself I was wrong. The rain from the day before had softened the soil, so maybe I was seeing shapes that weren't really there. But the longer I looked, the more sure I felt that someone had been there. That night I couldn't rest at all. I left the lantern burning low on the table and sat up in bed listening. The woods outside were alive with faint movements. Around midnight I heard a sound that made me stiffen, the soft creak of the porch boards under weight. I held my breath and listened harder. Another creak followed, closer to the door. I waited, heart hammering, but nothing else came. After a long time, I forced myself to get up and check. I unlatched the door and opened it just enough to look out. The porch was empty, the clearing beyond still. But when I stepped onto the boards, they made the same soft creak I had heard. Someone had been standing there. The fourth day, I debated leaving. My car sat at the end of the drive, ready to take me back. But I had told myself I would stay the full week. I didn't want to give up, didn't want to admit I was spooked by some noises. I told myself again it could have been animals, maybe even the wind shifting branches on the porch. I decided to stay. Still, I kept looking over my shoulder while I moved around. I started keeping the hatchet inside, leaning against the wall near the bed. I also found myself glancing often at the door, checking that the latch was in place. That night the sounds came again, only louder. More steps on the porch, a faint scratch against the wood. I sat upright on the bed, gripping the hatchet, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. But it never did. Eventually the sounds faded, and I sat awake until the first gray light touched the window. The next morning I stepped outside and found something new. In the dirt beside the cabin, clear as day, were footprints. Large, heavy human. They circled the cabin, stopping at the porch, then continuing toward the trees. My chest tightened as I crouched to study them. These were not old, The edges were sharp, made sometime during the night. I realized then that someone knew I was here. Someone had been walking around while I slept. I spent that day restless, walking back and forth across the small room, staring out the windows, checking the edges of the trees. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a cover, something heavy hiding movement I couldn't see. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair with the lantern burning low, the hatchet in my lap. The hours dragged. At some point I thought I saw movement beyond the glass, just a shift of shadow, like someone standing at the edge of the clearing. My breath caught, but when I looked harder, it was gone. By the 6th day I was worn down. My nerves were raw, my hands shook. I decided I would leave the next morning, cut my trip short by one day. I started packing slowly, folding my clothes, stacking my books, keeping the hatchet close by. That evening, as the light faded, I stepped outside one last time to bring in more wood. I froze on the porch. The dirt was covered in new footprints, dozens of them circling, stopping, pacing. Whoever had been out there had come back again and again. I dragged the wood inside, shut the door, and locked it. My heart was racing so hard I thought I might pass out. That night, the sounds came back, louder than ever. Steps across the porch, scratches against the wall, once a thud against the door, hard enough to rattle the frame. I held the hatchet ready, but the door didn't open. The noises circled the cabin until dawn. When light finally came, I packed the rest of my things in minutes. I opened the door to leave and saw the prints again, clear and sharp in the damp soil. They led back into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I walked fast down the drive to my car, throwing my bag into the back seat. The whole time I felt eyes on me, watching from the tree line. I climbed in, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. By the time I reached the nearest town, I was shaking so badly I had to pull over. I sat there a long time trying to steady myself. I never went back to that cabin. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The cabin I had rented sat deep in the woods, several miles away from the nearest paved road. It was supposed to be a place where I could unwind, get away from work and clear my head. I drove up there on a late afternoon, the kind of late summer evening when the light begins to fade a little earlier, but the air is still heavy and warm. The gravel road to the cabin was narrow, winding through tall trees that pressed close from both sides. Branches scraped my truck as I rolled along, and every bump in the road made the gear in the back rattle. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin appeared almost suddenly, tucked between the trees. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-story wooden structure with a small porch and a tin roof that had dulled with years of rain and sun. The clearing around it was uneven, dotted with tall grass and patches of bare dirt where old tires or wood piles must have sat. The air was still, so quiet that I could hear my own breathing once I cut the engine. I carried my bags inside and noticed the air was stale. It had that closed-up smell of wood mixed with dust, like the cabin hadn't been aired out in months. The place was simple. One main room with a couch, a little table, a wood stove, and a kitchen off to the side. A short hallway led to a single bedroom and a small bathroom. I checked the windows, tested the locks, and then opened a few to let fresh air move through. The woods outside were already starting to dim as the sun dropped behind the trees, and the sound of insects rose to fill the quiet. I unloaded my gear, lit a lantern, and sat on the porch for a while. At first, the silence was peaceful. I could hear crickets, an occasional bird, and the faint trickle of water from somewhere down the hill. But as the light faded further, the woods seemed to grow heavier. The tree line pressed in around the clearing, tall and dark, and I felt the first twinge of unease. Being alone didn't usually bother me, but there's something different about isolation when there's no one around for miles. That night, I cooked a simple meal and ate while listening to the faint hum of the lantern. The cabin creaked in the cooling air, each sound sharp and loud in the silence. When I finally lay down in the bed, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. I could hear faint noises outside, things shifting through the woods, branches breaking. At first I told myself it was deer, raccoons, or other animals. But the longer I lay there, the harder it became to sleep. Around midnight I finally drifted off. though it was a restless sleep filled with strange half-dreams. I woke to a sound. At first I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again. It was faint but distinct, the crunch of something on the gravel outside the cabin. I lay frozen, listening. The sound was slow, spaced out like deliberate steps. My heart started to pound. I tried to remind myself it could have been an animal, but gravel doesn't crunch that way unless something heavy is on it. The sound stopped, and the silence that followed was worse. I forced myself to get up and peek through the window. The clearing looked empty, pale under the light of the moon. My truck sat where I'd parked it, and the grass waved slightly in the night breeze. I didn't see anyone. I waited there at the window for a long time, scanning the tree line, but nothing moved. Finally, I told myself I was overthinking, went back to bed, and eventually dozed off again. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. The gravel did look disturbed, like something had moved across it, but there were no clear footprints. I shrugged it off and tried to focus on enjoying the day. I hiked a little through the woods, fished in the stream, and sat on the porch in the afternoon sun. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about the sound I'd heard. That night it happened again. I was sitting at the table, writing in a notebook, when I heard a faint scrape outside, like something brushing against the wall. My chest tightened. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, listening. After a few minutes, there was another sound, something moving along the porch, creaking the old boards under its weight. I held my breath. My truck was parked right there. If someone was outside, they were close enough to touch it. I stayed still for what felt like hours until the noises stopped. Eventually, I forced myself to turn the lantern back on, but I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin felt magnified, and every shadow seemed like it might shift into something else. On the third day, I started noticing small things. My cooler on the porch had been nudged slightly, not where I'd left it. The woodshed door, which I was sure I'd closed, was cracked open. At first, I thought maybe animals had done it, but I couldn't shake the thought of footsteps on the gravel. I started double-checking the locks and keeping my flashlight close. By the fourth night, my nerves were stretched thin. I had the lantern low, sitting on the couch, when I heard it again. This time it wasn't just on the porch. It was around the back, slow footsteps circling the cabin. The boards creaked, the gravel shifted, and I sat frozen, heart racing, gripping the flashlight like it was a weapon. I thought about shouting but stopped myself. If someone was out there, letting them know I was afraid wouldn't help. I stayed awake until dawn, every sound making me flinch. When the sun finally lit the clearing, I went outside to check. That's when I saw it. On the ground near the back wall, a cigarette butt still fresh enough that it hadn't collected dust or damp. I didn't smoke, and no one had been up here before me. My stomach dropped. Someone had been out there, close enough to lean against the wall and smoke while I sat just inside. The rest of the day I was on edge. I thought about leaving, but part of me didn't want to feel like I was running away from something I couldn't explain. I told myself I'd make it one more night, then pack up in the morning. That final night was the worst. I kept every light off and sat in the dark, listening. Hours passed. Around midnight, the sound started again. Gravel crunching, boards creaking, slow deliberate steps circling the cabin. My mouth went dry. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide anymore. I could hear breathing through one of the windows, slow and heavy, like someone was standing inches from the glass. I stayed completely still, afraid to even move. Then I heard the faint scrape of metal against metal, the door handle being tested. The lock rattled softly. My chest felt like it would explode. I reached for my flashlight and held it like a club. The handle rattled again, harder this time, and then silence. I waited in that silence until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. When I finally opened the door, I saw clear footprints in the dirt and gravel, heavy boots circling the cabin again and again. They led to the porch, to the windows, even to the back door. I followed them a few feet into the woods, but they vanished into the undergrowth. That was enough. I packed my bags in minutes, threw them in the truck, and left without looking back. Every bump of the road, every shadow between the trees made me tense, but I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I never found out who it was, and I didn't want to. Someone had been watching me that whole time, close enough to circle the cabin night after night. The thought of them standing outside, listening to me move inside, waiting, was worse than anything I could have imagined. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, years later, when I think about it, I still hear those footsteps on the gravel in the middle of the night, circling, waiting, patient in the dark. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden place tucked back deep in the woods. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to a friend of a friend who said it was fine if I used it as long as I cleaned up before leaving. I wanted a quiet place away from noise, a spot where I could just breathe, write a little, and sit by the fire. I didn't think much about how isolated it really was until I actually got there. The drive had already been long, several hours through winding roads that turned from asphalt to gravel, and finally into dirt. Once the road narrowed enough that tree branches scraped along the sides of my car, I knew I was nearly there. The cabin sat a good distance off the main highway. You couldn't see it from any road. You had to follow a faded track through the woods, then park near a clearing where the roof finally showed through. When I first stepped out, the silence felt heavy. No cars, no planes, just trees, wind, and the faint tapping of branches against each other. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. The cabin looked small but solid. Dark logs, a pitched roof, a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were smudged but intact. A padlock hung open on the front door, left there by whoever had used it last. Inside, the place smelled musty, like wood that had been closed up for too long. Dust floated in the air as I set my bags down. The furniture was basic. A couch with fabric that had seen better years, a small table, 2 chairs, and a wood stove in the corner. The bedroom held a narrow bed with a thin mattress. The sheets looked clean enough, though a little yellowed from age. I unpacked slowly, trying to get comfortable with the space. I stacked firewood by the stove, filled a metal bucket with water from the pump outside, and set out some food I had brought along. After a while, the quiet didn't feel so strange. I thought it was exactly what I needed. That first night passed without trouble. I cooked a simple meal, sat on the porch until it got dark, then lit a lantern inside. When the woods grew silent, I climbed into bed and listened to the faint sounds of wind outside. Sleep came easily. The second day was when the unease started creeping in. I spent most of the morning wandering around the property. The trees pressed in close, tall and thick, blocking much of the sunlight. There wasn't a real path beyond the clearing, just the faint signs of old trails that might have been animal tracks. I followed one of them for a while, crunching through leaves and snapping twigs underfoot until I realized how quickly the cabin had vanished from sight. I turned back before I went too far. The woods had a way of making distances feel longer than they were, and I didn't want to test my luck. That afternoon, I noticed something strange by the tree line. It was just a small stack of rocks, maybe 6 or 7, balanced carefully on top of each other. They were smooth stones taken from the creek that ran a short distance away. At first, I thought maybe someone had left it as a marker, or kids had built it at some point. It didn't bother me much, but it stood out because it wasn't there earlier that morning. When I went back out later, the stack was gone. The rocks lay scattered in the dirt as though someone had knocked them down. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I heard small noises outside, little cracks in the underbrush like footsteps that were too heavy to be animals. I told myself it was deer moving through the woods. Still, I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for silence again. The third day, I woke feeling restless. I decided to hike farther down the old track that led past the cabin. The dirt path stretched through the woods in a crooked line, dipping into hollows and climbing shallow rises. I followed it for maybe an hour, noticing old tire ruts pressed deep into the ground, faded but still there. The path ended in another clearing, this one overgrown. In the middle sat the remains of an old shack, nothing more than collapsed boards and a roof caved in on itself. I didn't stay long. Something about the place felt wrong. The wood was gray and rotten, and there were old cans scattered in the grass, rusted nearly through. I left quickly and headed back. When I reached the cabin again, I noticed something immediately. The front door was open. I had left it closed. I was sure of that. My stomach dropped. I stood in the clearing for a long time, scanning the area. The woods were still. the trees swaying gently in the breeze. No sound of footsteps, no movement. I finally stepped onto the porch and pushed the door wider. The inside looked the same as before. Bags where I left them, food still on the counter, nothing disturbed. I checked every corner, even the small bedroom closet, but nothing seemed touched. The door itself didn't have a lock, only that padlock you had to loop through the latch outside. I had left the padlock hanging there unlocked. Maybe the wind had pushed the door open, though I didn't remember leaving it unlatched. That evening I decided to light a fire in the stove, more for comfort than warmth. I sat watching the flames, trying to shake the feeling that someone had been inside. The woods outside pressed close against the cabin windows, and I couldn't help but glance up every few minutes, checking the glass for any shape or shadow. Later, when I stepped out to get more wood, I noticed something in the dirt near the porch steps. A footprint. It wasn't mine, it was longer, wider, the tread different from my boots. The edges were fresh, the dirt still crumbling at the sides. My chest tightened as I crouched down to study it. Whoever it belonged to had walked up toward the cabin. I turned, scanning the yard, but there were no other prints I could see. That night I barely slept at all. Every sound outside set me on edge. I kept the lantern low, sitting up in bed, listening. At one point I swore I heard breathing outside the window, steady and slow, before it faded into silence. By the fourth day I was exhausted. My hands shook as I made coffee on the stove. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, letting the isolation get to me. But when I stepped outside that morning, I saw something that made the hair on my arms rise. Another stack of rocks. This time it was taller. 10 or 12 stones balanced carefully near the tree line, directly across from the cabin. It hadn't been there the night before. I knocked it over myself, kicking the stones into the grass. My heart pounded hard in my chest. Whoever was doing it had to be watching me, waiting until night to creep close. I couldn't understand why. That night I heard the door creak. I froze in bed, staring into the dark. The fire had gone out hours earlier, and the room was pitch black except for faint light from the window. The creak came again, softer this time, wood bending under slow pressure. I reached for the lantern, but I didn't light it. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing. The sound stopped. Then came a different one. Soft steps on the porch boards, moving slowly, shifting weight with care. I could almost feel them just outside, inches from where I lay. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, gripping the edge of the mattress, staring at the dark outline of the window. Eventually the sounds faded. The woods fell silent again. When daylight finally came, I opened the door cautiously. The porch boards creaked under my feet, matching the sound I'd heard hours before. That was when I saw it. On the porch railing sat another stack of rocks. Smaller this time, just 3 balanced neatly. That was enough. I decided to leave. I packed quickly, shoving clothes into my bag, dumping food into the cooler. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting a face to appear there. When the car was loaded, I climbed in, turned the key, and drove fast down the track, branches scraping the sides again. But something followed me. In the rearview mirror, I caught sight of movement between the trees. A figure, dark and tall, keeping pace for a moment before fading back into the shadows. My chest tightened and I pressed harder on the gas. The road twisted sharply and I nearly lost control in the dirt. I didn't slow down until I reached the main highway miles later. Only then did I breathe easier. I didn't stop until I was hours away, back among other cars and towns and lights. When I finally pulled into my own driveway, I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the quiet street. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I thought about the shack I had found deep in the woods. I thought about the footprints, the rocks, the noises in the night. Someone lived out there far from everyone else, moving silently between the trees. Maybe they didn't like me being in their woods. Maybe they wanted me gone. Either way, I got the message and I left. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The cabin I had rented sat deep in the woods, several miles away from the nearest paved road. It was supposed to be a place where I could unwind, get away from work, and clear my head. I drove up there on a late afternoon, The kind of late summer evening when the light begins to fade a little earlier, but the air is still heavy and warm. The gravel road to the cabin was narrow, winding through tall trees that pressed close from both sides. Branches scraped my truck as I rolled along, and every bump in the road made the gear in the back rattle. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin appeared almost suddenly, tucked between the trees. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-story wooden structure with a small porch and a tin roof that had dulled with years of rain and sun. The clearing around it was uneven, dotted with tall grass and patches of bare dirt where old tires or wood piles must have sat. The air was still, so quiet that I could hear my own breathing once I cut the engine. I carried my bags inside and noticed the air was stale. It had that closed-up smell of wood mixed with dust, like the cabin hadn't been aired out in months. The place was simple. One main room with a couch, a little table, a wood stove, and a kitchen off to the side. A short hallway led to a single bedroom and a small bathroom. I checked the windows, tested the locks, and then opened a few to let fresh air move through. The woods outside were already starting to dim as the sun dropped behind the trees, and the sound of insects rose to fill the quiet. I unloaded my gear, lit a lantern, and sat on the porch for a while. At first, the silence was peaceful. I could hear crickets, an occasional bird, and the faint trickle of water from somewhere down the hill. But as the light faded further, the woods seemed to grow heavier. The tree line pressed in around the clearing, tall and dark, and I felt the first twinge of unease. Being alone didn't usually bother me, but there's something different about isolation when there's no one around for miles. That night, I cooked a simple meal and ate while listening to the faint hum of the lantern. The cabin creaked in the cooling air, each sound sharp and loud in the silence. When I finally lay down in the bed, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. I could hear faint noises outside, things shifting through the woods, branches breaking. At first I told myself it was deer, raccoons, or other animals. But the longer I lay there, the harder it became to sleep. Around midnight I finally drifted off, though it was a restless sleep filled with strange half-dreams. I woke to a sound. At first I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again. It was faint but distinct. The crunch of something on the gravel outside the cabin. I lay frozen, listening. The sound was slow, spaced out, like deliberate steps. My heart started to pound. I tried to remind myself it could have been an animal, but gravel doesn't crunch that way unless something heavy is on it. The sound stopped, and the silence that followed was worse. I forced myself to get up and peek through the window. The clearing looked empty, pale under the light of the moon. My truck sat where I'd parked it, and the grass waved slightly in the night breeze. I didn't see anyone. I waited there at the window for a long time, scanning the tree line, but nothing moved. Finally, I told myself I was overthinking, went back to bed, and eventually dozed off again. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. The gravel did look disturbed, like something had moved across it, but there were no clear footprints. I shrugged it off and tried to focus on enjoying the day. I hiked a little through the woods, fished in the stream, and sat on the porch in the afternoon sun. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about the sound I'd heard. That night it happened again. I was sitting at the table writing in a notebook when I heard a faint scrape outside, like something brushing against the wall. My chest tightened. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, listening. After a few minutes, there was another sound, something moving along the porch, creaking the old boards under its weight. I held my breath. My truck was parked right there. If someone was outside, they were close enough to touch it. I stayed still for what felt like hours until the noises stopped. Eventually, I forced myself to turn the lantern back on, but I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin felt magnified, and every shadow seemed like it might shift into something else. On the third day, I started noticing small things. My cooler on the porch had been nudged slightly, not where I'd left it. The woodshed door, which I was sure I'd closed, was cracked open. At first I thought maybe animals had done it, but I couldn't shake the thought of footsteps on the gravel. I started double-checking the locks and keeping my flashlight close. By the fourth night, my nerves were stretched thin. I had the lantern low, sitting on the couch, when I heard it again. This time it wasn't just on the porch. It was around the back, slow footsteps circling the cabin. The boards creaked, the gravel shifted, and I sat frozen, heart racing, gripping the flashlight like it was a weapon. I thought about shouting but stopped myself. If someone was out there, letting them know I was afraid wouldn't help. I stayed awake until dawn, every sound making me flinch. When the sun finally lit the clearing, I went outside to check. That's when I saw it. On the ground near the back wall, a cigarette butt, still fresh enough that it hadn't collected dust or damp. I didn't smoke, and no one had been up here before me. My stomach dropped. Someone had been out there close enough to lean against the wall and smoke while I sat just inside. The rest of the day I was on edge. I thought about leaving, but part of me didn't want to feel like I was running away from something I couldn't explain. I told myself I'd make it one more night, then pack up in the morning. That final night was the worst. I kept every light off and sat in the dark listening. Hours passed. Around midnight, the sound started again. Gravel crunching, boards creaking, slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. My mouth went dry. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide anymore. I could hear breathing through one of the windows, slow and heavy, like someone was standing inches from the glass. I stayed completely still, afraid to even move. Then I heard the faint scrape of metal against metal, the door handle being tested. The lock rattled softly. My chest felt like it would explode. I reached for my flashlight and held it like a club. The handle rattled again, harder this time, and then silence. I waited in that silence until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. When I finally opened the door, I saw clear footprints in the dirt and gravel, heavy boots circling the cabin again and again. They led to the porch, to the windows, even to the back door. I followed them a few feet into the woods, but they vanished into the undergrowth. That was enough. I packed my bags in minutes, threw them in the truck, and left without looking back. Every bump of the road, every shadow between the trees made me tense, but I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I never found out who it was, and I didn't want to. Someone had been watching me that whole time, close enough to circle the cabin night after night. The thought of them standing outside, listening to me move inside, waiting, was worse than anything I could have imagined. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, years later, when I think about it, I still hear those footsteps on the gravel in the middle of the night, circling, waiting, patient in the dark. I had been planning the trip for weeks, maybe months, if I counted the late-night searches and the hours of scrolling through pictures of cabins hidden in the woods. I wanted something quiet, something out of the way where I could get away from work, from city noise, from people. The idea of being alone in a cabin sounded perfect. Just me, the trees, the silence, and time to breathe. When I found a listing for a small cabin sitting on private land deep in the forest, far from the main road and away from the nearest town, I booked it right away. The photos showed an old wooden structure with a porch, a stone chimney, and windows looking out into thick trees. It looked peaceful in the pictures, like something from another time. The drive to get there was long. The paved road ended at a faded wooden sign, and from there it was a gravel path that wound through endless forest. The trees closed in tighter the farther I went, their branches stretching overhead, blotting out much of the sky. I drove slowly because the path was uneven, full of dips and rocks, and the tires slid sometimes on loose gravel. My phone had lost service halfway through the drive, and my GPS screen froze on an old image. That gave me a strange feeling, like I was leaving the world behind, heading into a place where signals and connection no longer reached. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was even smaller than I had expected. The wood was darker than in the pictures, weathered from years of storms and sun. The porch sagged slightly at the edges, and the roof was covered in pine needles. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by trees so thick that beyond a few feet in any direction, there was nothing but a wall of trunks and branches. I stepped out of the car and the silence hit me right away. No cars in the distance, no voices, no hum of electricity, just the faint sound of wind moving through leaves and the occasional crack of something in the woods. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room with a small kitchenette against one wall, a table with 2 chairs and a bed pushed into the corner. There was a fireplace with a stack of wood beside it and shelves holding old pots, mismatched plates, and a lantern. The air smelled of wood, dust, and something faintly damp like the scent of earth after rain. I dropped my bag on the floor and walked through, checking everything out. There was no running water, just a pump outside. The toilet was an outhouse, a short walk from the cabin. It was exactly what I wanted. Quiet, basic, and cut off from the world. The first night was calm. I lit a fire in the fireplace, cooked some simple food, and sat at the table with only the crackling of the flames for sound. When I went to bed, the silence pressed in on me. I could hear the woods in a way I never could in the city. The creaks of trees, the rustle of leaves, and the small movements of animals outside. Every sound carried through the stillness, making it feel like something was always just outside the walls. I told myself that was part of the charm, part of what I had wanted. The next day I walked the property. The land stretched for acres, according to the listing, though there were no fences or markers, just endless forest. The trees were tall and old, their bark rough and dark, their roots twisting across the ground. The forest floor was thick with needles, moss, and fallen branches. I followed faint trails where animals must have moved and found a small stream about a 10-minute walk from the cabin. The water was cold and clear, moving fast over smooth stones. I spent most of the day exploring, then returned to the cabin, tired but content. That night, I sat on the porch after dark. The air was cool and the stars were sharp above the trees. But as I sat there, I got the sense that the woods felt different at night. In the day, they seemed alive in a natural way, filled with light and sound. At night, they seemed heavier, like they were holding something in. I heard branches snap deeper in the woods. Not the small snaps of squirrels or rabbits, but louder, like weight was being pressed down on them. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a bear. Still, the sound came closer, then stopped. I stared into the black wall of trees, but saw nothing. After a while, I went inside, shut the door, and locked it. The lock was small, just a simple latch, but I felt better hearing it click. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up. I heard something outside, faint at first, then clearer. It sounded like footsteps on the porch, slow, careful steps. My body went cold and I held my breath. The sound moved across the wood, paused near the door, then faded away. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into a light sleep. But my dreams were filled with shadows moving outside the cabin. The next morning, I stepped outside, heart pounding, half expecting to see something on the porch. At first, everything looked normal. Then I noticed marks on the dirt near the steps. Not paw prints, shoes. They weren't my prints. The tread was different, larger. They led up to the porch, across it, and then back into the woods. I stood there staring at them for a long time. My first thought was that maybe a hiker had wandered onto the property, but the cabin was miles from the nearest marked trail. And why would someone walk right up to the cabin in the middle of the night? The unease sat heavy in me, but I tried to push it down. I told myself not to overthink, not to let my imagination run wild. I went about the day as best I could. I cooked, read, and walked to the stream again. But every time I stepped into the trees, I felt like someone was watching. My skin prickled, and I kept looking over my shoulder. I told myself it was just because of the prints, that I was making myself jumpy. Still, I cut my walk short and went back. That night, I made sure the door was locked tight and I placed a chair under the handle. Even though I knew the door wasn't strong enough to stop someone who really wanted in, I sat by the fire listening. For a long time, nothing. Then late into the night, I heard it again. Footsteps, not rushed, not stumbling. Slow, steady steps on the porch. They stopped right outside the door. The firelight flickered on the wood walls and my chest tightened. I sat frozen, listening, every nerve on edge. After what felt like forever, the steps moved again, fading back into the dark. In the morning, I checked again. More prints, fresh. Whoever it was had been right there again, only feet from where I was sitting. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving out, but part of me resisted. I had wanted this trip for so long, and I didn't want to give it up after only a couple of nights. I also told myself maybe it really was just someone wandering, maybe it wouldn't happen again, but deep down I knew it wasn't random. That evening I stayed inside. I didn't go out on the porch, didn't look at the stars. I kept the lantern low and sat in the shadows listening. Hours passed and then it came again. The sound of steps, deliberate and careful. They circled the cabin this time. I could hear them on the leaves, moving slow around the walls. My breath felt trapped in my chest. At one point, the steps paused outside the window, and though the curtains were drawn, I imagined eyes on the other side of the thin fabric, watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sky finally lightened, I stepped outside. There were prints all around the cabin now, circling it. some pressed deep like whoever it was had stood in one place for a long time. My hands shook as I looked at them. This wasn't an accident. Someone was coming here on purpose. I knew I couldn't stay. I went inside, packed quickly, and loaded my bag into the car. But when I turned the key, the engine didn't start. I tried again and again, but nothing. Panic rushed through me. I popped the hood, but I didn't know enough to fix anything. And then I saw it. The wires were cut. Cleanly cut. Someone had been under the hood of my car. My stomach dropped. This wasn't random. This was planned. Whoever had been walking around the cabin had disabled my only way out. I stood there in the silent clearing, heart hammering, the trees pressing in all around. There was no cell service, no way to call for help. The nearest road was miles away through dense woods I didn't know. I realized then how trapped I really was. I went back inside, locked the door, and pushed furniture against it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely move the chair. I sat by the fire again, waiting for night because I knew they would come back, and they did. The footsteps started earlier this time, before it was even fully dark. They circled the cabin slowly, dragging out the sound. Then they came onto the porch, boards creaking under the weight. The steps stopped at the door. For a long time there was silence, just the sound of my own pulse in my ears. Then the handle moved, rattling against the chair I had wedged there. I pressed my back against the far wall, staring at the door, barely breathing. The handle shook harder, the wood groaning, but the door held. After a while, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep. I sat awake all night, gripping a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, waiting for them to come back. They didn't, but the prints were there in the morning, deeper and closer than before. For the next 2 days, I barely moved from the cabin. I rationed the food I had, kept the fire low, and stayed as quiet as possible. Every night, the footsteps returned, circling, pressing in, rattling the door, testing the windows. I thought about running through. I remember the night I stayed in that cabin more than any other night of my life. It was supposed to be a quiet trip, a break from everything, a way to get away from the noise of the city and all the weight that had been pressing on me. The cabin was small, tucked deep in the woods, far from the road, far from people. When I first saw it, it looked almost perfect in a strange way. The wooden walls were old but strong, the roof slanted and patched with darker wood where repairs had been made, and the windows cloudy with dust. The path leading to it was uneven, just dirt and roots with no sign of anyone else being nearby. That was part of why I chose it. I had driven out there in the late afternoon, my car rattling over the gravel until I could go no farther. From there, I had walked about a half-mile down a narrow trail until the trees opened just enough for the cabin to appear. My pack felt heavy, but I had carried everything I thought I would need. Food, water, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, matches, a knife, and a small first aid kit. I had planned to stay for 2 nights, maybe 3, just to clear my head. Inside, the cabin smelled of dry wood and old dust. There was one room with a small iron stove in the corner, a table with 1 chair, and a bed frame with a thin mattress. The mattress looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The fabric worn thin, so I spread my sleeping bag on top of it. There was no electricity, no running water, only the stove for heat and a lantern that someone had left behind on a shelf. I set my things down and walked around, testing the place out, getting used to it. The silence around the cabin was heavy. The woods pressed in from all sides, and the air felt different than it did back in town. As the sun dropped lower, I gathered some wood from just outside the cabin and stacked it near the stove. I cooked a small meal on a camp stove I had brought with me, then sat at the table listening to the sounds outside. The woods were never really silent. There was always the rustle of branches, the small steps of animals in the brush, the distant call of a bird. But as night fell, the sounds seemed to stretch farther apart, and each one felt sharper. The first night passed without anything unusual, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up thinking I heard something near the walls. Once I thought I heard a soft thud outside, like someone had stepped on a log. I sat up holding the flashlight, waiting, listening, but nothing followed. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, it took a long time before I managed to sleep again, and even then it was shallow and broken. The next morning was cold. I stepped outside and the air bit at my skin, even though the sun was shining through the trees. I looked around the clearing, scanning the ground. That was when I noticed it. The dirt near the corner of the cabin was disturbed. At first I thought it was nothing, maybe where water had washed through, but then I crouched down and looked closer. There were footprints. Not boots like mine, not shoes, bare feet. The prints were clear enough that I could see the outline of toes pressed into the soft earth. I froze, staring at them. They were small, not childlike, but not large either. Maybe the size of a woman's foot, though wide and rough, as if whoever made them had walked barefoot often. I looked around quickly, but there was nothing else, just the trees standing silent. The prints led away from the cabin into the woods and vanished in the undergrowth. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen anyone when I arrived. Hadn't passed another car, hadn't noticed any signs of people at all. Yet someone had been near the cabin during the night. Someone had been close enough to touch the wall. I spent the rest of that morning uneasy, checking my supplies, making sure my knife was sharp and within reach. I kept looking out the window, though the glass was so foggy it barely gave me a view of the clearing. I thought about leaving, but I told myself it was probably nothing serious. Maybe some local person passing through. Maybe someone who lived rough in the woods. They hadn't tried to get inside. They hadn't left anything else. But that day dragged on, every sound in the trees making me tense. A branch snapped in the distance and I turned sharply, heart pounding. I tried to distract myself by walking farther down the trail in daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often I thought I heard steps behind me, faint and careful, though when I turned there was nothing but trees. When night came again, I locked the cabin door with the rusty latch, though I doubted it would hold against much force. I sat with the lantern lit, my knife on the table, listening to the woods outside. Hours passed like that, the silence pressing in, broken now and then by a rustle or a knock of wood. Around midnight I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was a soft sound at first, like fingers brushing against the wall. Then it came again, a slow dragging noise against the wood. I held my breath, gripping the knife, staring at the door. The sound moved along the side of the cabin, slow and steady, like someone was circling. I felt the air in my lungs burning, but I didn't dare move. After what felt like forever, the noise stopped. The woods went still again. I waited, my ears straining, until finally exhaustion won and I fell into a thin sleep, the knife still in my hand. The next morning I forced myself outside. I checked the dirt near the cabin again and my stomach twisted. More footprints, fresh ones. They were scattered around the cabin now, closer to the door, as if someone had walked back and forth during the night. The prints circled the whole place. I knew then that it wasn't just chance. Whoever it was, they had been watching, waiting, moving around while I was inside. My skin crawled at the thought that while I had been lying in the sleeping bag, half asleep, someone had been only a few feet away, walking quietly in the dark. I packed my bag quickly, ready to leave, but then I stopped. The trail was long and narrow, and I didn't know if whoever had been outside might be waiting somewhere along it. I told myself I would leave at midday when the sun was high, and I would walk quickly and not stop until I reached my car. So I waited, trying to steady myself, pacing the small cabin, but as the hours passed, I felt trapped. Every time I glanced at the window, I thought I saw movement between the trees. A flash of something pale, like skin, gone before I could focus. I stood at the window, staring into the forest until my eyes burned, but nothing stayed long enough to be sure. By afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my pack, tightened the straps, and opened the cabin door. The air outside felt heavier than before. I stepped out quickly, looking in every direction. The woods seemed empty, quiet except for the rustling of leaves in the wind. I started down the trail, forcing myself to move fast, my eyes darting to every shadow. At first it was just the usual forest sounds, but then I heard something else. A branch cracked behind me. I spun, my heart in my throat, but the trail was empty. I stood frozen, listening until another faint sound came, off to the side this time. Something moving through the brush, keeping pace with me. I kept walking, faster now, the strap of my pack cutting into my shoulder. My knife was in my hand, though it shook as I held it. The sounds didn't stop. Every few minutes I heard them, closer, then farther, like someone slipping through the trees, staying just out of sight. I wanted to run, but I was afraid that if I did, whatever was following me would break into a run too. The walk back to the car felt endless. My mouth was dry, my legs ached, and still the sounds followed. At one point I thought I saw someone between the trees, a pale shape, tall and thin, standing still and watching. I blinked and it was gone. When I finally reached the edge of the trail where the car was parked, my relief nearly made my knees buckle. But as I stepped into the clearing, I stopped cold. The ground around my car was covered in prints. Bare feet, dozens of them circling the vehicle. My windows were smeared with dirt as if someone had pressed their hands and face against the glass, peering inside. My chest tightened so much it hurt. I hurried to the car, yanked the door open, and threw my pack inside. My hand shook as I started the engine, the sound too loud, echoing through the woods. For a moment I thought I saw movement in the trees again, a figure slipping back into the shadows. I drove away as fast as the road would allow, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror over and over. The woods seemed endless, the narrow road twisting, but finally the trees thinned, and the highway opened in front of me. Only then did I let myself breathe, though it was shallow and shaky. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there or why they were circling the place watching me. Maybe it was someone who lived hidden in those woods, someone who didn't want strangers around. Or maybe it was worse, someone who waited for people like me, alone and far from help. What I do know is this: those prints around the car weren't there when I arrived. Whoever they were, they had been waiting. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I had been needing a break from everything for a while. My work had me sitting behind a desk for hours every day, and the noise of the city was starting to drain me in a way that was hard to explain. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you don't get with traffic and neighbors and people rushing around all the time. A friend of mine once mentioned an old cabin that his family owned deep in the woods, somewhere far enough that you couldn't hear or see another house for miles. He told me they didn't use it much anymore, and when I asked if I could stay there for a week just to get away, he said it was fine as long as I brought my own supplies and locked up when I left. The drive out took longer than I expected. The paved road eventually turned into gravel, and then that gravel narrowed into dirt that was filled with deep grooves from tires. The trees swallowed both sides of the path, tall pines and thick underbrush that seemed to press closer the further I went. My car jolted and shook as I crawled along, careful not to bottom out on the uneven ground. I lost track of time a bit because there were no signs, no markers, just endless green and shadow until finally I spotted a small clearing with a structure sitting in the middle of it. The cabin looked older than I thought it would. The wood was dark, weathered from years of rain and sun, and the roof sagged slightly on one side. There was a porch with 2 steps, the boards creaking as I tested them with my foot. The front door had a heavy iron latch and a lock that looked like it hadn't been changed in decades. I carried my bags inside and set them down, dust rising from the wooden floor with every step I took. Inside, the air was cool and stale, the kind of smell that builds up in a place left closed for too long. The furniture was sparse: 1 wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed with a thin mattress in the corner, and an old wood stove with a rusted pipe running up through the roof. A single small window on each side of the cabin let in dim light. It wasn't comfortable, but I hadn't come here for comfort. I had come for quiet. After unpacking, I walked around outside to get a better sense of the place. The clearing wasn't large, maybe 50 feet across before the trees thickened again. Beyond the cabin, a narrow trail led deeper into the woods, but I wasn't eager to follow it just yet. I wanted to stay close, get used to the area, and settle in before wandering too far. The silence was immediate, heavy. No cars, no hum of electricity. Not even the distant sound of a plane overhead. Just trees shifting slightly in the breeze and the occasional caw of a crow somewhere far off. That first night, I sat on the porch as the sun sank and the shadows stretched across the clearing. The air cooled quickly, and by the time the light was gone, the forest around me was a wall of black. I lit a lantern I had brought and set it inside the cabin before locking the door and lying on the bed. The mattress sagged under my weight. The sheets smelled faintly of mildew, but exhaustion settled over me quickly. Somewhere in the night I woke up. It was still dark, the lantern had gone out, and for a moment I couldn't tell what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it, soft steps outside on the porch. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something heavier, but the sound was measured, not random. A slow weight pressing into the boards one after the other. The creak of the porch seemed too precise, too steady. My chest tightened as I lay completely still, straining to hear. The steps stopped, and the silence that followed was worse. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the dark ceiling until the faint blue of dawn began seeping through the window. When I finally got up and opened the door, the porch was empty. The ground beneath it looked undisturbed, no clear tracks in the dirt. I told myself it had to have been my imagination, that maybe the wood had shifted from the cool air, or maybe some animal had padded across without leaving a clear mark. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been deliberate, like someone had been standing just outside the door. That day, I tried to distract myself. I gathered firewood from the edge of the clearing, tested out the stove, and took a short walk along the narrow trail. It wound through thick pines and dipped into a hollow before rising again. At one point, I found what looked like a hunting blind made from branches stacked into a crude wall. It was old, partly collapsed and empty, but it added a strange weight to the forest, like someone else had been here often enough to build it. When night came again, I felt uneasy. I set the lantern closer to the bed, the light flickering across the walls. Sleep didn't come easily. My ears stayed alert, waiting for the same sound, and sure enough, sometime past midnight, I heard the creak of the porch again. Slow, deliberate. My throat tightened and I held my breath, every muscle frozen. The steps moved toward the door and stopped. For a long stretch of time, nothing happened. Just silence pressing against the thin wooden walls. When I woke in the morning, I wasn't sure when or how I had fallen asleep, but my body felt heavy with unease. I checked outside again, looking for prints, but the ground gave me nothing. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I told myself it was just nerves. Maybe there were animals that moved strangely in these woods, or maybe the wood really did settle at night. On the third night, the sound came again, but this time it didn't stop at the porch. I heard something brush lightly against the wall, like fingertips dragging along the wood. My chest pounded so hard it hurt, and I gripped the edge of the mattress, staring at the door even though I couldn't see it in the dark. The dragging sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, circling slowly. I didn't sleep at all after that. When morning came, I went outside, walking the perimeter of the cabin. Near the back, in the soft earth by the wall, I saw it, the faint outline of a boot print. Not an animal, not random settling. Someone had been there, circling the cabin in the night. The rest of the day, I couldn't sit still. I gathered my things, ready to leave, but when I reached my car and turned the key, the engine clicked and died. I tried again, nothing. The battery was dead, though I hadn't left the lights on. A cold weight sank in my stomach. That night, I didn't light the lantern. I sat in the dark, my back pressed against the corner of the room, a hatchet from the woodpile gripped tightly in my hand. Hours crawled by, and then I heard it again, the porch creaking, the slow steps. But this time, instead of circling, whoever it was tried the latch. The metal rattled softly. My breath caught in my throat and I held still, gripping the hatchet so tight my hands hurt. The latch stopped moving after a while, and the silence stretched until I wasn't sure if they had gone or if they were waiting just beyond the door. When dawn finally came, I opened the door slowly. The clearing looked the same, quiet and still. But in the dirt by the steps, I saw fresh boot prints leading into the trees. I didn't care about the dead car anymore. I packed what I could carry, slung my bag over my shoulder, and left on foot. I followed the dirt road back the way I came, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see someone following. It took me hours of walking, my legs aching, my throat dry, until finally I reached a paved road. A passing truck slowed when I waved it down, and I climbed in without hesitation. I never went back for the car. A week later, I told my friend what had happened, and he said he'd send someone to retrieve it. I didn't ask if they found anything, if the tires were slashed or if someone had tampered with it. I didn't want to know. What I do know is that the cabin is still there, deep in those woods, and someone else is out there too. Someone who walks quietly at night, circling, waiting. I had been planning a weekend away from everything for months. Work had drained me. City noise had worn me down, and I wanted silence. Real silence, the kind you can only find deep in the woods where even the sound of your own breath feels louder than it should. I rented a small old cabin that sat at the end of a dirt road near a lake. It wasn't advertised much, just a simple listing that looked half abandoned, but that made it more appealing. I wanted isolation. The drive there was longer than I expected. The paved roads narrowed into rough gravel paths, then into a single dirt track that looked like it hadn't been driven on in weeks. Branches leaned low, scraping the top of my car as I pushed deeper into the forest. I saw no other vehicles, no hikers, no cabins along the way. Just trees thick and endless crowding out the sky. The GPS on my phone kept losing signal, flickering on and off until eventually the screen just froze. I had printed out directions, but even with those, every turn looked the same. Every dirt path looked like it could lead nowhere. When I finally found the cabin, it felt like stumbling on something forgotten. It was small, made of old wood darkened with age and weather. The roof sagged slightly, the windows had a cloudy look, and the porch creaked when I stepped on it. There was no lock on the door, just a heavy latch. The place smelled faintly of damp wood and dust when I went inside. The single room was simple. A cot in the corner, a wooden table, a chair, and a small stove against the far wall. There was no power, no running water, and no sign of anyone having been there in years. I unloaded my bag, set my lantern on the table, and sat for a while in the stillness. At first it was calming. I could hear birds outside, the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. I unpacked some food, filled the small stove with wood, and got a fire going. The warmth made the cabin feel less empty. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. But the first night was harder than I thought it would be. When the sun went down, the forest seemed to close in tighter. The darkness outside was absolute. Not like the city where light leaks into every corner. Here, if I looked out the window, I couldn't see even a few feet past the glass. Just blackness pressing against the cabin. I lay on the cot, listening. Every small noise felt sharp, important. A scrape outside. A thud somewhere far off. A faint crunch like footsteps on leaves. I told myself it was animals. The woods are full of animals and they make noise. But once the thought got into my head that someone could be out there, standing just beyond the reach of the lantern light, it wouldn't leave me. I barely slept. The next morning I tried to shake it off. I boiled some water on the stove, had a simple breakfast, and walked down to the lake. The water was still, perfectly flat, reflecting the trees like glass. There was no dock, no boats, no cabins along the shore. Just silence. I stayed there a while, skipping rocks, trying to enjoy it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see someone standing at the tree line, just staring. There was never anyone there, but the feeling stayed. Back at the cabin, I checked around the building. The dirt around the porch had footprints. At first, I thought they were mine from when I unloaded the car, but they didn't line up. Some were smaller, some larger. I crouched down, looking closer. The prints were fresh, pressed sharply into the soil. They circled the cabin, stopping at each window before moving on. My stomach sank. I hadn't walked around the cabin the night before. I had gone straight inside. The rest of the day, I kept looking over my shoulder. I tried to read, tried to relax, but I couldn't. Every time the wind shifted the trees, I thought I saw movement. Every snap of a twig made my chest tighten. I told myself maybe a hunter had wandered by, or a hiker, or even kids exploring. But why circle the cabin? Why stop at the windows? That night I sat at the table with the lantern lit, staring at the door. The woods outside felt alive, like they were waiting. Hours passed. At some point I must have drifted off in the chair because I woke to a faint noise, a scrape low against the wall of the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear. There it was again. Slow, dragging like something being pulled across wood. Then silence. I didn't move for a long time, just sat frozen, staring at the wall. When morning came, I went outside. On the side of the cabin, near the window by the cot, there were marks in the wood. Long, thin scratches, too high to be from an animal. They looked deliberate, like someone had dragged a stick or maybe a knife across the wall. I felt sick. Whoever had walked around the cabin the day before had come back. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back to the city. But the road out was long and rough, and the idea of breaking down alone out there scared me even more. I told myself I'd stay one more night and leave in the morning. That day dragged on endlessly. I stayed near the cabin, pacing, checking the woods. Every time I thought I saw movement, I rushed toward it, but there was never anything there. Still, the sense of being watched never went away. As the sun started sinking, I felt panic rising in my chest. I didn't want night to come. I barricaded the door with the chair, piled extra wood on the stove to keep the fire strong, and sat with my flashlight in hand. Hours passed. Then the sound started. At first, just a faint crunch of leaves outside. Then slow, steady footsteps circling the cabin. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight. The steps stopped at the windows one by one. I couldn't see anything through the black glass, but I knew someone was out there, standing inches away from me. Then came the scrape again, long, slow against the wall. This time it moved from one side of the cabin to the other, circling, dragging along the wood. I sat frozen, barely breathing. The steps moved to the door. I heard the latch shift. It held, but the sound of it moving made my blood run cold. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to the steps fade and return, never fully leaving. When the first light of morning touched the window, I grabbed my bag and bolted. I didn't pack everything. I didn't clean up. I just shoved what I could into my backpack, ran to the car and started it without even looking back at the cabin. The dirt road felt endless, every turn looking the same. But eventually the trees thinned and the first stretch of pavement came into view. I drove until I saw other cars, other people, until I felt like I had truly left the woods behind. Even now I can't explain it. There were no ghosts, no strange creatures, just someone out there. Someone circling that cabin in the dark, watching through the windows, dragging something across the walls, waiting. I never saw their face. I never heard their voice. But I know they were there. And I know they'll keep coming back to that cabin, waiting for the next person who thinks they want to be alone in the woods. I'll never go back. I never liked cabins. Not the polished ones people rent for family vacations with big windows and stocked kitchens, but the old silent kind that sit alone deep in the woods, built out of rough logs and half-rotted planks. The kind that seemed like they were made for hiding instead of living. Still, when I found myself in one, far away from anyone else, it wasn't because I wanted to be there. It was because I thought it would be quiet. A place to rest, a way to cut myself away from everything that had been pressing on me back in town. I thought I would find calm there. I thought wrong, the cabin was not mine. It belonged to a man who used to work with my father. He had left it sitting unused for years. When I asked, he said I could take the keys and stay as long as I wanted. I drove out in late afternoon, past the cracked two-lane roads that grew thinner and thinner until the pavement ended and gravel spat under the tires. The forest around me thickened until it swallowed the sky. It was late summer, but already cooling down. Shadows stretched long across the dirt road, and my stomach tightened as if I already knew something was waiting for me out there. When I pulled up, the cabin sat in a small clearing, its wood blackened by time and weather. The roof sagged in the middle. The front steps leaned. A stack of firewood sat against the side, but most of it was gray and damp. No sound carried through the clearing except the slow ticking of the car engine cooling down. Inside, the air smelled stale, like old pine mixed with mold and dust. The single room was simple. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the wall, a wood stove in the corner, and one shelf with canned food. The floorboards groaned under every step. In the corner sat a cracked enamel basin for washing, and a bucket that made me think too much about how long I'd be staying. I told myself it was fine. I wanted quiet, and this was quiet. But the quiet wasn't the kind I expected. In town, quiet meant a soft hum in the background. Cars far away, dogs barking, people moving somewhere close. Here it was different. Here silence had weight. It pressed against me, made every sound sharp and loud. My footsteps sounded like someone else's. My breathing echoed in my ears. I sat at the table and realized I could hear the blood in my head. The first night I couldn't sleep. I lay on the bed listening to the forest. It creaked and cracked like bones. Now and then, a snap carried from the trees, louder than the rest. Maybe it was a branch falling. Maybe it was an animal. But each time it came, my chest tightened. The walls of the cabin felt paper thin, like nothing at all separated me from whatever was out there. I tried to close my eyes, but every time I drifted off, I thought I heard movement. Soft steps pressing into dirt, leaves shifting under weight, the faint drag of something across wood. I told myself it was my imagination. I told myself it was squirrels or raccoons. I repeated it until my jaw ached from clenching. In the morning, I checked outside, nothing. The clearing looked untouched. My car sat the way I left it. The air was cold enough to burn my lungs. I convinced myself that nothing had happened, that I had only been on edge from being somewhere so unfamiliar. The second night was worse. I tried to make the place more comfortable, stacking firewood, heating the stove. laying out my things neatly as if order would make me feel safer. But as the sun dropped, the forest grew darker than I expected. By the time night fell, I couldn't see more than a few feet past the windows. The cabin felt smaller. The silence grew heavier. Lying in bed, I heard it again. Steps faint but steady, circling. Not fast, not stumbling. Careful. The kind of steps a person makes when they don't want to be heard. My skin prickled and I held my breath. The steps stopped and I waited for them to start again. When they did, they came from the other side. I sat up in bed, frozen. My eyes went to the door. It had no lock, only a wooden latch that slid into place, too thin to stop anyone who wanted to come in. I slid it shut anyway, though I knew it wouldn't matter. The noise went on, sometimes near, sometimes farther, sometimes nothing at all for long stretches. Just enough time to make me believe it was finished before it started again. Finally, it stopped for good, and I sat there staring at the door until my eyes burned. At first light, I went outside. The ground was damp from dew, and I thought I might see tracks. I searched around the cabin. Nothing. The soil was firm, scattered with pine needles and leaves. If something had been there, it hadn't left a clear mark. Still, the feeling stuck in me, deep like a splinter. The third night, I decided I wouldn't sleep. I stayed at the table with a lantern, staring at the door at the window, listening. I fought against my eyelids as they sagged heavier and heavier, and every time my head dipped, I snapped it up again. Hours passed. My body ached from the chair, my throat dry from holding still. Then I heard it. Not steps this time. A scrape, wood against wood. It came from the side of the cabin. Slow, drawn out, like something hard dragged along the wall. My skin went cold, my breath shallow. I thought about running to the car. But the keys were on the table, and I knew the noise of opening the door, crossing the clearing, starting the engine, it would all be too loud. If someone was out there, they'd hear every move. I stayed still. The scraping came again, this time on the far side near the window. Then silence. I forced myself to check in the morning. My legs trembled as I walked the cabin's edge. On one wall near the back, I found it. A long, fresh scratch down the wood. Not from weather. Not from age. Something had cut into it. Something sharp and deliberate. The next day, I thought about leaving. I almost packed my bag and loaded the car. But the road out was long, twisting, and empty. It meant driving in the dark if I left at night, and something about that thought filled me with more fear than staying. I told myself I could handle one more night. That was the mistake. When dark fell again, I stayed on the bed, lantern off, trying to keep my breathing quiet. Hours passed with nothing. My nerves smoothed out a little, enough that I almost believed it had all been in my head. But then I heard it, the door latch. A soft rattle, I went stiff, heart hammering so loud I swore it would give me away. The latch rattled again, this time longer, harder. Then it stopped. Silence spread so deep I thought maybe I had imagined it. I strained my ears until they rang. Nothing. Then, from the window, glass flexing, the faint squeal of pressure. I wanted to run. I wanted to burst out the door and take my chances in the trees, but my body wouldn't move. I lay there frozen while the sounds went on. Finally, silence again. I don't know how long I stayed awake after that. The hours crawled. The black outside the window never seemed to lift. When morning finally came, it was as if nothing had happened at all. The latch sat in place. The window was intact. But I knew what I had heard. That day I didn't think about it anymore. I acted. I packed my bag, carried it to the car, and loaded everything inside. My hands shook so badly I dropped the keys twice. The moment the engine roared to life, relief washed over me. I put the cabin behind me and drove until the trees thinned and sunlight returned. I never went back. Later, when I told myself it might have been animals, the scratch in the wood always came back to me. Animals don't drag sharp tools along walls. Animals don't test latches or press against glass, and every so often, when I wake in the middle of the night in my own bed, I swear I can still hear it. The careful steps, circling, waiting for me to fall asleep. I had been planning a short trip to the mountains for months, the kind of trip where I could switch off my phone, stay away from the noise of the city, and just be alone for a while. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere that didn't have neighbors, right outside the window, somewhere that felt cut off enough that I could hear my own thoughts again. A friend of mine had once mentioned an old rental cabin tucked deep into the forest. Not one of those tourist cabins where a dozen families stay over the summer, but a single, isolated place that hunters and fishermen sometimes used. I managed to track it down online, and when I saw that it was available for the week I had free, I booked it without thinking twice. The drive there took longer than I expected. The paved roads eventually turned into cracked asphalt, then into gravel, and finally into a single dirt track that twisted its way through thick trees. By the time I reached the cabin, I felt like I had been swallowed by the woods. The trees stood tall and tight together on all sides, their tops blocking out most of the sky, and the air felt colder than it had just a few miles back. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing, its wood dark from age and weather. It wasn't large, just one story with a front porch, a door, and a couple of windows. There was no other building in sight, no sign of human life anywhere around, just endless forest. I killed the engine and sat for a minute in the quiet. The ticking of the cooling car echoed strangely in the stillness, and the silence pressed in heavier than I expected. Even the birds seemed hushed, though every now and then I caught a distant caw or the rustle of leaves high up in the branches. I got out, stretched, and unlocked the cabin door with the key that had been mailed to me in advance. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and faint mildew. The floor creaked under my boots, and the furniture looked as though it had been there for decades, solid, heavy, and built to last. There was a main room with a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and a small kitchen area with just the basics. A short hallway led to a bathroom and a single bedroom with a narrow bed covered in a wool blanket. The place had electricity, though the lights were dim and yellow and there was no signal on my phone. That first night, I thought the silence would be what unnerved me most. Lying in bed, I could hear the building settling, the occasional groan of wood and the faint patter of something, maybe mice, in the walls. I told myself it was nothing unusual for a place this old and this far out. I had expected quiet, and I got it. But as the night stretched on, I started hearing something else. Faint, irregular thuds like something moving outside. I lay still, my ears straining. It came once, then silence, then again, softer, as if a weight had pressed down on the wooden porch and lifted. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other animal. After all, I was in the middle of their territory. I rolled over, pulled the blanket tighter, and eventually drifted off. The next morning, I stepped outside with a mug of coffee and noticed marks on the porch. Not claw marks or scratches, but faint impressions in the thin layer of dust that coated the boards. They looked like boot prints, pressed into the wood, leading toward the door and then away again. They weren't mine. Mine had been clear enough from when I carried my bag in, but these were different, wider, flatter, as if someone had stood there during the night. I walked out into the clearing, scanning the ground. The dirt around the cabin was hard-packed, but a few paces into the trees, I found patches of softer soil where something heavy had moved through. The prints weren't perfectly shaped, but they suggested a person, not an animal. My stomach tightened. I reminded myself hunters sometimes passed through, or maybe hikers had stumbled close to the place. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crawled up the back of my neck. I spent that day hiking short trails near the cabin. The woods were dense and quiet, the kind of quiet that made every crack of a twig or sudden flutter of wings snap like a gunshot. I tried to enjoy the peace, tried to push away the thought of those prints. By the time I returned in the late afternoon, I convinced myself I had been overthinking. That night, though, the noises came again, heavier this time, definite steps across the porch. My heart hammered as I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The steps moved slowly, pausing near the door. The wood creaked under weight. I held my breath, straining to hear if the door handle turned, but it never did. After what felt like hours, the steps faded. The next morning, I checked again. Fresh prints, clearer this time. They stopped right at the door and circled the cabin. I felt the first true spike of fear then, the kind that sinks into your gut and doesn't let go. Someone had been outside, moving around while I slept. I kept the door locked all day and tried to distract myself with books I had brought. But I couldn't help glancing at the windows. scanning the tree line. More than once I thought I saw a figure still and half hidden, but when I looked closer there was nothing, just trunks and shadows. That night was worse. The noises came earlier, before midnight, deliberate steps moving around the cabin. I stayed in bed, clutching the flashlight I had found in a drawer. At one point, the steps stopped outside the bedroom window. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My skin prickled as if someone was standing just inches away, separated only by thin glass and a curtain. Then the sound of fingers brushing lightly against the wall. Not scratching, not pounding, just a slow drag. When morning came, I went out and saw the smudge of a handprint, faint but real, near the window. That was when the isolation stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling dangerous. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was miles away, and the road was rough. Besides, I tried to convince myself maybe it was just some local messing with me. Maybe kids sneaking around. But the prints were too large, too deliberate, and the cabin was too deep in the woods for pranks. On the fourth night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the main room with the fire low, the flashlight and a kitchen knife on the table. Around 1 a.m, the sound came again. Steps on the porch. Slow, steady, closer. I felt the floorboards faintly vibrate as if weight pressed down on them. Then silence. Minutes crawled by. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then came the soft turn of the doorknob. It rattled gently. Not forced, not slammed, just tested. The lock held. The rattling stopped. Then the sound of breathing. I swear I could hear it, low and steady, just outside the door. I sat frozen, every muscle tense. After what felt like forever, the breathing stopped and the steps moved away. I didn't move until dawn. The next morning I decided I couldn't stay. I packed my bag, shoved everything into the car, and was about to leave when I noticed something wedged under the edge of the porch. A scrap of cloth, dirty and torn, caught on a nail. I pulled it free. It looked like part of a shirt sleeve. Human. That was enough. I drove out as fast as the dirt road allowed, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see someone standing in the clearing watching me leave. When I finally reached town hours later, I stopped at the first gas station and just sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to steady my hands. I looked back once more at the forest stretching out in the distance. I never went back to that cabin. I had been planning the trip for weeks, maybe months if I was honest with myself. The idea of spending a few days alone in a small cabin far away from the city sounded perfect. I wanted the quiet, the silence that only deep woods could give. My life had been nothing but noise. Cars on the street, phones buzzing, people talking all around me. I told myself I needed the kind of silence where the only sound was the wind in the trees or the crack of wood in the fireplace. The cabin I chose wasn't anything fancy. It was an old structure I found listed on a local site. The photo showed a single-story building with a pitched roof, a small porch, and dark wood siding that looked weather-beaten. The place sat at the edge of a large forest, about an hour from the nearest town. It didn't even have running water, just a pump outside and a wood stove inside. That was exactly what I wanted. I thought it would be a chance to feel stripped down. Disconnected, I left early in the morning, packed my car with enough supplies for 4 days, cans of food, a sleeping bag, firewood just in case, a lantern, and some tools. I had a small cooler with me too, filled with water and some meat I thought I could cook over the stove. I made sure to bring extra batteries, a flashlight, and a small knife I always carried when I went hiking. The drive out was smooth. The further I got from the town, the more the road narrowed. It went from paved to gravel and finally to dirt, winding through thick patches of trees. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked even smaller than in the pictures. The porch sagged a little on one side. The wood siding had faded to a dull gray and the single window out front was cloudy with dirt. There was no other building in sight, no sign of another person. Just trees, thick and endless. I parked my car close, unloaded, and carried everything inside. The cabin was one room with a corner where a stove sat, a wooden table with 2 chairs and a single bed against the wall. A pile of old newspapers sat by the door. The air smelled like dust and dry wood. There was a hatch in the floor near the back wall, probably for storage, and a ladder that went up to a tiny loft where more sleeping space had been built. The loft was so small it could barely fit a mattress. I liked the simplicity of it. The first day was easy. I unpacked, got the stove working, and ate canned soup while I sat on the porch. The forest was calm, only the sound of leaves rustling and birds calling. By the time night came, I lit the lantern and lay down in the bed with my sleeping bag. The silence was heavier than I imagined. The kind of silence where you hear your own breathing too clearly, but I fell asleep quickly. It was in the middle of the night when I first woke up. I didn't know why at first. My eyes opened in the darkness and I stared at the ceiling. The lantern had gone out. The only light was a faint glow coming from the moon outside the window. I lay there listening. That was when I realized it was the silence itself that had woken me. It wasn't normal. The forest should have been alive with sound, crickets, owls, something. But it was still, completely still. I tried to push it from my mind and went back to sleep. The second day, I went out to explore a little. I followed a trail into the woods that seemed faintly marked, maybe from deer or people who had been here before. I didn't go too far. I just wanted to get a feel for the area. The forest was thick with pines and tall trees that blocked most of the sun. The ground was soft, covered with fallen needles and damp leaves. I noticed a lot of broken branches on the ground, bigger ones than what wind alone would usually bring down. Back at the cabin, I spent the rest of the day reading and cooking. I had brought a small book with me, but I kept finding myself staring out the window instead, just watching the tree line. The quiet was deeper than I expected, and I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before when everything had gone silent. That night, I was more aware of the noises outside. The first half of the night was normal, with crickets and wind moving through the trees. But sometime later, the noises stopped again. Just like before, it was sudden and absolute, like the forest had been cut off. I sat up in bed and listened. My skin prickled. I couldn't hear anything, not even wind. Then came a sound. It was faint at first, a single crunch like something stepping on dry leaves. It came from outside, somewhere near the tree line. I held my breath. Another crunch followed, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it toward the window. The beam cut across the glass, but I saw nothing beyond it except the reflection of my own hand shaking. I told myself it was an animal. A deer maybe, or a raccoon. But deep down I knew it didn't sound like that. The steps were too heavy, too slow, spaced apart like someone was carefully moving forward. I didn't move until I finally heard the sound fade away, the crunches becoming more distant until the silence returned. I barely slept after that. The third day, I almost packed up and left. But I convinced myself to stay. I didn't want to feel like I had wasted the whole trip. During the day, things seemed fine. The sun was out and the forest looked normal. I kept telling myself I was just overthinking, letting the silence of the place get into my head. Still, I couldn't ignore what I had heard. I walked the edge of the tree line near the cabin, scanning the ground for tracks. The soil was soft in places and I thought I saw impressions, shapes that looked like prints but not clear enough to be sure. They were longer than I expected for an animal, almost like a shoe but without a real outline. I crouched there for a long time, staring before I finally forced myself to step away. That night was the worst. I went to bed early, lantern burning beside me. I left my knife on the table next to the bed, within reach. For hours, nothing happened. Then, sometime past midnight, I woke up again. The lantern had burned low and the room was dim. The silence was back. I didn't even have time to sit up before I heard it. The sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The wooden boards creaked under the weight. My chest tightened and I froze. The steps moved across the porch, stopping near the door. The old newspapers by the entrance rustled like something brushed against them. Then came the sound of pressure against the door itself, like someone pressing a hand or shoulder into it, testing it. I stared at the door, barely breathing, waiting for it to open. It didn't. After what felt like forever, the pressure stopped. The footsteps moved again, this time circling the cabin. I heard them scrape against the wall, then shift to the side where the window was. I turned my head slowly toward the glass, but the lantern's dim light only reflected the inside of the room. I couldn't see out. I sat there gripping the knife, every muscle in my body tense. The steps circled back to the porch and then faded into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. By the fourth day, I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay another night in that cabin. I packed up quickly, shoving everything into my bags. I kept checking the tree line as I loaded the car. The forest looked calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. Before I left, I walked back inside the cabin one last time. Something caught my eye near the back wall by the storage hatch. The wooden floor had fresh marks on it, long scratches as if something heavy had been dragged across it. I hadn't noticed them before. I left right then, slamming the door behind me and getting into the car. The dirt road felt longer than before, every turn making me check the mirror. When I finally reached the main road and saw another car pass by, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. Even now, when I think about it, I know what I heard. Those weren't animals. The way the footsteps moved, the way they circled, the way the door was tested, it was deliberate. Someone was out there in the woods watching the cabin, waiting. I left the cabin behind, but I can't stop replaying those nights in my head. The silence, the steps, the scratches near the hatch in the floor. I'll never know what would have happened if I stayed one more night, but I know I'll never go back to a cabin alone again. I had been planning to spend a week alone in a cabin far away from the city for months. The idea was simple. I wanted space. I wanted silence. I wanted to leave behind the steady hum of traffic, the glowing screens, the endless noise of other people living their lives so close to mine. I had always liked being out in nature, though most of my experiences were just short hikes or camping trips near towns. This time was different. I had rented a cabin in a remote part of the woods that was at least 10 miles from the nearest paved road. It wasn't one of those polished vacation rentals with Wi-Fi and fresh sheets. It was an old hunting cabin I found listed on a small local forum, a place someone said had running water from a well, a wood stove, and solar panels that might power a couple of lights if the batteries still worked. The man I rented it from didn't ask many questions. He just gave me a lockbox code for the key and warned me to bring more than enough food and supplies because stores weren't anywhere nearby. When I drove up the dirt road leading into the woods, the first thing I noticed was how quickly the world around me swallowed all signs of civilization. The road was rough and narrow, lined with thick trees that pressed close on both sides. I had to slow down several times to crawl over rocks or dips where the earth had washed out. My car was coated in dust within minutes. The air outside looked heavy, tinted slightly gold as the late summer sun pushed through the canopy. I hadn't seen another car in at least an hour, and my phone had already lost signal 20 minutes earlier. That was fine by me. It was exactly what I wanted. When I finally reached the cabin, I pulled off into a small clearing where the ground opened up enough to park. The cabin looked older than I expected, but still solid. It sat on a foundation of stones, the logs dark with age but tightly fitted. The windows had shutters closed over them, and the roof sagged a little near one corner but didn't seem damaged. A short set of steps led to a small porch. The place gave off the feeling of being left alone for a long time, the kind of silence that settles deep into wood and soil. I got out of the car and stretched. The air smelled different than it did back in town, cleaner but heavier somehow, like damp earth and leaves that had been sitting untouched. I stood there for a while listening. There was no distant hum of cars, no barking dogs, no planes overhead. Just the faint rush of wind moving through trees and the occasional cry of a bird. It was so quiet that it felt unnatural at first, as if I had walked into a space the world had forgotten. I opened the lockbox, took the key, and went inside. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. Inside there was one main room with a wood stove against the far wall, a small table, a couple of wooden chairs, and a narrow bed pushed into the corner. The floorboards creaked under my boots. There was a shelf with some old canned goods, though I had brought my own food. The windows were small, covered by shutters on the outside, which made the room feel darker than it should have during daylight. I unpacked slowly, setting my gear in a corner, stacking my food on the counter, and making sure my lantern worked. The solar-powered lights flickered on when I tested the switch, though they were weak. At least I had a backup. I made a mental note of where the axe leaned near the door, along with a short stack of firewood. As the evening fell, I went outside again and walked a little around the clearing. The trees stood tall and close, thick trunks rising into a dense canopy that blocked much of the sky. The ground was uneven, covered in roots, rocks, and patches of ferns. There was a faint trail leading into the woods, but it looked overgrown. I decided I'd explore further the next morning when I had more daylight. For now, I just wanted to get a fire going inside, cook a simple meal, and settle in. That first night passed quietly. I cooked some rice and beans on the stove, ate while sitting at the small table, and listened to the forest outside. There were distant animal sounds, an owl, what might have been a coyote rustling in the brush. The fire crackled softly, throwing flickers of light across the walls. I read a little from the book I had brought, then stretched out on the bed. The mattress was thin, the blanket scratchy, but I was tired enough that it didn't matter. The silence pressed in around me. I drifted off, thinking how good it felt to be away from everything. The next day started simply enough. I woke with the light, made coffee on the stove, and went outside. The morning was cool, the air damp. Mist hung between the trees, drifting in pale sheets that made the woods look endless. I walked the faint trail a little, noticing how quickly it narrowed and twisted out of sight. The ground was soft in places, sinking under my boots. I didn't go too far because I hadn't brought my pack or any water, but I marked the way with small broken branches so I could find it again later. The cabin felt comfortable during the day. I spent time splitting some wood, checking around the outside of the building and making sure the place was secure. But by the second night, I noticed something that unsettled me. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a small sound outside near the tree line when I was cooking dinner. At first, it seemed like an animal moving through leaves, but it didn't pass by or fade. It lingered, faint shifting like something waiting just beyond the light of the cabin. I went outside with my lantern, shining it toward the trees. The light barely reached far before being swallowed by shadows. I didn't see anything. I told myself it was just a deer or raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had paused when I came out, as if aware of me. That night, I found it harder to sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every faint sound outside made me hold my breath and listen. Around midnight, I heard what I thought was a soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves close to the porch. I stayed still, staring at the ceiling, gripping the flashlight in my hand. Nothing followed. After a long while, I convinced myself it was just my mind exaggerating natural sounds. Still, sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I walked the edge of the clearing to see if I could find tracks. The ground was scattered with leaves and pine needles, making it hard to see anything clear. But in one spot near the porch, the earth looked pressed down, as though someone had stepped there. It wasn't obvious, but it bothered me enough that I kept looking. Further toward the trees, I thought I saw more faint impressions, but they blended too much with the ground to be certain. I tried to push it out of my mind. The days passed slowly. I read, walked the trail a little further each time, and kept the stove burning at night. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't constant, but at times when I stepped outside or looked out the window, the hairs on the back of my neck would rise, like someone stood hidden just beyond my sight. Once, while splitting wood, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a figure shifting quickly out of view. When I went closer, there was nothing. The nights were the hardest. The forest grew so dark that even with the shutters open, no light reached inside. I kept the lantern close, but its glow barely touched the corners of the room. More than once, I woke up certain I had heard something moving around the cabin, a slow scrape against wood, or the soft thump of weight near the porch. Each time I stayed perfectly still, waiting until silence returned. On the fifth night, I woke to the sound of something tapping on the wall outside. Not hard, just a faint knock, irregular, like fingers brushing against the wood. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear. The tapping stopped, then came again from another part of the wall. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it through the window cracks, but the shutters blocked most of the view. I couldn't see anything. I sat awake the rest of the night, the fire dying down, the cabin sinking into shadows. The next morning, I checked outside. On the porch railing, I noticed fresh scratches, thin lines carved into the wood. They hadn't been there before. They weren't deep, but they were deliberate, crossing over one another. I touched them with my fingers, the wood rough where it had been gouged. My chest tightened. It wasn't an animal. Someone had been there. The thought of packing up and leaving came quickly, but the road out was rough and long. I told myself maybe it was just local kids messing around, though the nearest house was miles away. Still, I started keeping the axe inside with me at night, leaning against the bed. I double-checked the shutters and locked the door every evening. That night, the sounds came again. This time it was footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. The crunch of leaves, the shift of weight on wood. They went around the walls, pausing near the windows. I sat in the dark, holding the axe in one hand and the flashlight in the other, barely breathing. The steps stopped near the door. Silence followed. I waited, every muscle tense, expecting the handle to turn. It never did. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded into the woods. The next day, I found more signs. Near the edge of the clearing, there were small piles of stone stacked together, balanced in strange little towers. 3 of them, each about a foot tall. They hadn't been there before. My stomach sank when I saw them. It wasn't a prank. Someone was watching me, leaving signs to remind me they were out there. I lasted 2 more nights. I had been looking for a place to get away from everything for a while. Life in the city had started to grind me down in ways I hadn't even noticed until it all piled up. The noise, the endless movement of people, the pressure of work, the way every day felt the same, it was eating at me. I decided to take some time off, a week alone in the woods where I could clear my head and reset myself. I didn't want to camp this time. I wanted something more solid. So I found a cabin listing through an old rental site that looked like it was barely kept up anymore. The price was cheap, almost suspiciously so. But the photos showed a small wooden cabin tucked deep into the trees near a lake. It looked rough around the edges, but it was exactly what I wanted. The drive out there was long. The paved road turned into gravel and then into dirt. And as I kept going, I saw fewer signs of people. No houses, no farms, not even the occasional car parked off a trail. Just trees pressing in on both sides and the narrow track in front of me. When I finally reached the cabin, it felt like I had driven straight out of one world and into another. It sat alone, its wood weathered gray, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. A stone chimney leaned against one side, and there was a porch with a railing missing in 2 spots. The door was heavy and old, its paint almost completely peeled away. The whole thing looked like it hadn't been used much in years. Inside, the place was simple. A single large room with a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen area with cabinets and a sink that I doubted had running water, and a narrow hallway leading to 2 small bedrooms. There was dust on everything, a fine layer that suggested no one had stayed here in a long time. The air smelled like damp wood and the faint musk of something animal, maybe mice living somewhere in the walls. Still, it felt like the kind of solitude I had been craving. I unloaded my stuff. Food, water, sleeping bag, and a few other supplies I brought in case the cabin was more run down than expected. The sun was still up and the silence of the woods pressed around me. It was strange how quickly I noticed the difference. In the city, there's always sound, even at night. Here, when I stepped outside, I only heard the occasional bird and the creaking of trees in the breeze. That first night, I settled in quickly. I set up my sleeping bag on the old bed frame in the larger of the 2 rooms. The mattress was stained and smelled faintly of mildew, so I rolled it off and just used my bag on the wooden slats. I ate a cold meal from the cans I'd brought, then went outside to sit on the porch until it got dark. The forest changed as the light faded, the shadows thickening, the air cooling. The quiet grew heavier, until it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. When I finally went back inside, I noticed something that I hadn't before. The cabin made sounds. Not just the settling of wood or the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. It was more than that. Small creaks from places that didn't line up with the breeze. Faint taps along the walls like something brushing against them. I told myself it was animals. Mice in the walls, maybe squirrels climbing on the roof. It made sense. Still, when I lay down in my bag, the darkness pressing close, the sound of those small movements kept me awake longer than I wanted. The next morning I walked to the lake. The trail was barely visible, overgrown in spots, but I followed it down until the trees opened and the water spread out in front of me. It was larger than I thought, wide and calm, the surface like glass reflecting the sky. No boats, no docks, nothing to suggest people came here often. I stood at the edge for a long time just listening. The water lapped softly against the shore, and the trees around me swayed in the wind. For the first time in months, I felt calm. I spent most of the day exploring. The woods were dense, the kind where it was easy to lose track of direction if you didn't pay attention. I stuck close to the trail and the landmarks I noticed on the way out. The further I went, the more I realized just how alone I really was. No cut paths, no signs of campfires, no trash left behind by careless hikers. Nothing. It was like stepping into a piece of land that no one had touched in decades. That night, the noises came back. Louder this time. It wasn't just taps or small creaks. I heard what sounded like something moving across the porch, slow steps pressing against the old boards. I froze in my bag, staring at the ceiling, listening as the sound moved past the door and then stopped. My heartbeat pounded in my ears and every second stretched longer. I told myself again that it had to be an animal. A raccoon maybe, or a deer nosing around. Still, I didn't sleep well. Every time the cabin made another sound, I flinched awake. By the third day, I was starting to notice other things, small details that didn't sit right. When I came back from the lake, I found the door to the cabin slightly open, even though I was sure I had pulled it shut. Inside, one of my food cans was on the floor, dented. I thought maybe I had knocked it over without noticing. But the more I looked at it, the less sense it made. I kept my things in my pack, zipped up, and the can had been inside. I told myself I must have left it loose, but a tight feeling started building in my stomach. That night, I tried to block the sounds out by stuffing pieces of cloth in my ears. It helped a little, but I still woke up in the middle of the night. Even with my ears covered, I felt something was different. A shift in the air, the sense of something moving nearby. I pulled the cloth out and listened. The cabin was silent at first. Then I heard it. Slow, deliberate steps inside the cabin, moving across the wooden floor. My chest tightened and I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The steps moved past my room, down the hall, then faded. I lay there until morning light finally crept through the window, my whole body stiff with fear. In the daylight, the cabin looked the same as always. Nothing was out of place. I checked every corner, every cabinet, even under the beds, nothing. I told myself I had dreamed it, that maybe I had half woken and imagined the sound. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Something was wrong. On the fourth day, I decided to explore further into the woods, thinking maybe I could find signs of animals or people nearby that would explain the noises. I followed a deer trail deeper until I came to a clearing. There in the dirt, I saw footprints. Not animal prints, but human ones. They weren't fresh, maybe a day or two old, pressed into the ground where the soil was softer. Bare feet, the toes and heels clear in the mud. They led out of the clearing and back into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to understand. Who would be out here barefoot? There were no other cabins, no camps, nothing for miles. When I went back to the cabin, I noticed more things. My sleeping bag was unzipped, though I had left it zipped up. My water jug had been moved to the other side of the room. Small things, but they added up. Someone had been inside while I was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I sat against the wall with my flashlight in hand, waiting. The hours dragged by, and sometime past midnight, I heard the steps again. This time I was sure of it. Slow, steady, moving across the floor. The flashlight shook in my hand and I didn't turn it on. I just listened, every muscle in my body tense. The steps came closer to my room, paused at the door, then moved away again. I sat there until dawn, my mind racing, my body trembling from staying alert all night. The next morning, I made up my mind. I had to leave. Whatever was happening here, I wasn't safe. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into my bag without care. But when I stepped outside, something froze me in place. In the dirt just off the porch were fresh footprints, bare human and leading away into the trees. I didn't waste time. I got into my car, turned the engine, and started down the track. The forest pressed around me, the trees blurring as I drove. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see someone standing in the road behind me, watching. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, the cabin long behind me. When I finally made it back to the city, the noise and the crowd felt strange, almost overwhelming after so many days of silence. But it was also a relief. I kept thinking about the cabin, about the footprints, about the sounds in the night. Whoever had been out there, they had been inside while I slept. They had been watching. And if I hadn't left when I did, I don't know what would have happened. I never went back. I had been wanting to get away for a while, to cut myself off from the noise of everything and just sit somewhere quiet where I didn't have to think about work, traffic, or people. I found a listing online for an old cabin deep in the woods of a northern state. It was cheap, which should have been a red flag, but I convinced myself it was because it was so far out from town. The photos made it look cozy enough. One main room with a small kitchen corner, a fireplace, and a bedroom in the back. The wood looked worn but solid, and the area around it looked peaceful. Just trees and a dirt road fading into the distance. It was the kind of place that seemed perfect if you wanted to be left alone. The drive took me nearly 8 hours. By the time I reached the last stretch of road, the paved highway had turned into cracked asphalt, then gravel, and finally nothing but a dirt path winding between tall, thick trees. My car shook on every bump. Branches scraped the sides, and I realized quickly that this wasn't a road you'd want to be stuck on if it rained. Still, I pressed on. The air outside looked heavy, like the sky could open up any second, and I just wanted to reach the cabin before it got dark. When I finally pulled up, I felt both relief and unease. Relief because I had actually found the place, unease because it looked far more isolated than the pictures had made it seem. The trees pressed in tightly on all sides, blocking much of the late evening light, and the dirt clearing in front of the cabin was barely wide enough for me to park. The cabin itself looked old, much older than I had expected. The wood was dark with age. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were streaked with dirt. It looked less like a cozy retreat and more like a place no one had lived in for years. I stepped inside, carrying my bags, and immediately smelled the dampness. The air was stale, as if the place had been shut tight for too long. The wooden floor creaked under my weight. The living space had only the bare minimum: a rough couch, a table with 2 chairs, a small counter with a sink, and a rusty stove. The bedroom had an old bed frame with a thin mattress. There was no electricity, only a stack of candles and a few kerosene lamps on the counter. The bathroom was nothing more than an outhouse behind the cabin, which I hadn't realized from the listing. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling by unpacking my things. I set my food supplies on the counter, spread my sleeping bag over the bed, and lit a lantern. Outside, the last of the daylight was fading, and by the time I finished settling in, the forest around me was already a wall of darkness. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional sound of leaves shifting in the wind or a distant branch cracking. It was the kind of quiet that makes every small noise feel too loud, like the whole forest is listening. That first night I couldn't sleep. The mattress felt damp, and every time I started to doze, I'd wake to some faint sound outside. At one point, I thought I heard something brushing against the cabin wall like the scratch of a branch, or maybe something else. I told myself it was just my imagination and pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, things felt different. Sunlight streamed weakly through the trees, and the forest looked less threatening. I made coffee on a small camping stove I had brought, then walked the area around the cabin to get a sense of it in daylight. The trees were thick, mostly pine, with a carpet of needles covering the ground. I noticed how uneven the land was, with dips and ridges that twisted out of sight. Not far from the cabin, I found an old fire ring filled with ashes long gone cold. It made me wonder when the last person had actually been out here. I spent most of the day reading and trying to relax, but even in daylight I couldn't fully shake the feeling that something about the place was off. The woods felt too quiet, as though there weren't any animals. I didn't hear birds, didn't see squirrels. Just stillness. When the sun started to set, I felt a weight settle in my chest. That night the noises came back. They weren't loud, but they were enough. A soft crunch of leaves, a faint scrape on the side of the cabin. I sat up on the bed, listening, straining my ears. My heart thumped so hard I could hear it in the silence. I wanted to believe it was just deer moving through the trees, or maybe raccoons, but the sounds felt too deliberate. I blew out my lantern to sit in the dark, hoping if anyone or anything was outside, they wouldn't know I was awake. The noises went on for what felt like hours, stopping and starting, moving around the cabin. I lay there frozen until finally exhaustion dragged me under again. On the 3rd day, I started noticing little things. The ground near the cabin had fresh prints. They weren't animal tracks, they were boot prints. At first I thought they might be mine, but they were larger, wider. They circled the cabin, pressed into the damp ground as if someone had walked slowly around close to the walls. My stomach turned when I saw them. Someone had been here at night, close enough to touch the cabin if they wanted to. I told myself maybe a hunter or hiker had wandered too close, but that didn't explain why they would walk circles around the cabin in the middle of the night. That day I kept glancing toward the tree line, convinced I was being watched. Every shadow looked like it was hiding someone. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the idea of driving that dirt road in the dark was worse. I decided to stick it out one more night. That night was the worst. It started with the usual sounds outside, but then I heard something more. Faint but clear. A creak on the porch steps. Slow, careful weight pressing down on the old wood. My chest tightened. I sat up, staring into the black of the cabin, barely breathing. Another creak. Whoever it was, they were right outside the door. I grabbed the small hatchet I'd brought for firewood and held it tight. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped it. I waited, listening, every nerve screaming. The door didn't open, but I heard the handle rattle softly like someone testing it. Then silence. I stayed that way for hours, sitting in the dark, gripping the hatchet, my body stiff and aching. Eventually, as dawn crept through the trees, the sound stopped. When I finally worked up the nerve to step outside, the sight made my stomach flip. The dirt around the porch was covered in prints. Clear boot prints, leading up to the steps and around the cabin again. There was no mistaking it now. Someone had been there, circling, watching, trying the door. I didn't waste time. I stuffed my things into my bag, threw them in the car, and started down the dirt road as fast as I could without wrecking. The whole drive out, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. The road felt longer than it had coming in, every bump shaking my nerves more. When I finally reached the paved highway, the relief was overwhelming. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, surrounded by people and noise.
Only then did I finally feel like I could breathe. Later, when I thought back on it, I realized how bad it could have gone.
I had been alone, miles from anyone, in a cabin with no lock strong enough to keep someone out if they wanted in. Whoever was out there had the patience to circle the place night after night, waiting. If I hadn't left when I did, I might not have left at all.